I was born Eleanor Margaret Hayes, became Eleanor Whitmore when I married Thomas in 1978, and remained that person until 4 weeks ago, the day after we laid him to rest. I'm 71 years old with weathered hands that still remember how to arrange fresh flowers from our garden and the precise way Thomas liked his morning coffee prepared. I'm telling you this so you understand that before everything shattered, I was simply a wife who believed she had raised a son with honor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and what I'm about to share with you will shock you to your core. Because the day after my beloved husband's funeral, my own son walked into our family home and handed me eviction papers like I was a stranger squatting on his property. But what he didn't know was that his mother had secrets that would turn his greed into his greatest nightmare. Thomas and I had built Whitmore Estate Planning Services from nothing more than a single-room office above the local pharmacy in Millbrook, Connecticut. For 43 years, we helped families protect their legacies, draft their wills, and secure their futures. Thomas was the attorney, the face of the business, while I managed everything behind the scenes. The client relationships, the filing systems, the intricate details that kept hundreds of families' most sensitive information organized and accessible. People trusted us with their deepest secrets. We knew which marriages were failing, which children couldn't be trusted with inheritance, which family businesses were hemorrhaging money, and which elderly clients were being manipulated by relatives, circling like vultures. We held the keys to generational wealth, family feuds, and carefully constructed trusts designed to protect assets from the very children who now demanded immediate access. Our son Marcus had always been different from us. Where Thomas and I found purpose in service, Marcus found opportunity in exploitation. He'd graduated from law school 15 years ago, but instead of joining our practice as we'd hoped, he moved to Manhattan to work for a corporate firm specializing in hostile takeovers. He visited twice a year, always with his latest girlfriend, always making subtle comments about our quaint small-town operation and how we were leaving money on the table by not expanding or modernizing. Marcus never understood that our business wasn't about maximizing profit. It was about trust, relationships, and genuinely caring for families during their most vulnerable moments. When Mrs. Patterson needed her will updated after her husband's stroke, we didn't charge her a penny because she was living on Social Security. When the Rodriguez family couldn't afford proper estate planning after their restaurant burned down, Thomas spent weekends helping them navigate insurance claims and temporary guardianship arrangements for free. These weren't just clients to us. They were neighbors, friends, people whose children had grown up with Marcus, whose grandchildren we'd watched take their first steps at community festivals. But Marcus saw them differently. He saw billable hours, missed opportunities, and what he called emotional business decisions that compromise profitability. The tension between our philosophies came to a head 3 years ago when Thomas suffered his first heart attack. Marcus flew in from New York, not to comfort his father, but to conduct what he called a business continuity assessment. He wanted us to sell the practice to a larger firm, retire to Florida, and let him manage our transition to a more passive income model. Thomas was barely out of the hospital when Marcus presented us with a proposal to merge with Hartfield & Associates, a corporate estate planning mill that processed wills like an assembly line. They promised to retain our client base while streamlining operations for maximum efficiency. What they really meant was firing our longtime secretary, Mrs. Chen, replacing our personalized service with automated document generation, and tripling fees while reducing the time spent with each family. We refused, of course. This practice represented our life's work, our reputation, our commitment to treating people with dignity during their most difficult transitions. Thomas told Marcus that the business would continue as it always had, serving families first and profits second. That conversation ended with Marcus storming out, declaring that we were too old and too stubborn to see the bigger picture. He didn't visit again until Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months later. The cancer was aggressive, but Thomas fought with the same quiet determination he'd brought to everything else in his life. Even as chemotherapy weakened his body, he continued working, meeting with clients from our home office when he couldn't make it to the main building. He was particularly focused on updating our own estate planning documents, spending hours reviewing trusts, insurance policies, and business succession plans. Marcus's sudden renewed interest in family coincided perfectly with Thomas's deteriorating health. He began calling weekly, ostensibly to check on his father's condition, but his questions always circled back to business matters. How were we handling the workload? Were clients concerned about continuity? Had we considered bringing in a partner to share responsibilities? During Thomas's final month, Marcus took a leave of absence from his Manhattan firm and moved into our guest bedroom to help with caregiving. I was grateful for the support, despite our philosophical differences. Watching your life partner fade away is a burden too heavy for one person to carry alone, and Marcus seemed genuinely devoted to making his father comfortable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He took over many of the business's administrative tasks, claiming he wanted to lighten Thomas's load. He organized client files, digitized old records, and even met with some of our longtime clients to reassure them about service continuity. I thought he was finally understanding what this practice meant to our family and our community. Thomas passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring, holding my hand as sunrise streamed through our bedroom window. His last words were about ensuring our clients would be taken care of, that the business would continue to serve families with the same integrity we'd maintained for 4 decades. I promised him that his legacy would remain intact. The funeral was beautiful, exactly as Thomas would have wanted. Simple, dignified, focused on celebrating a life dedicated to service rather than mourning what was lost. Our church was packed with clients, colleagues, and community members whose lives Thomas had touched. Story after story was shared about his kindness, his integrity, his willingness to go above and beyond for families in crisis. Marcus delivered a moving eulogy, speaking about his father's dedication to justice and his unwavering commitment to protecting families. He talked about the values Thomas had instilled in him, the importance of putting principles before profit, and the responsibility we all had to continue his legacy of service. I was proud of my son in that moment, believing that perhaps grief had helped him understand what truly mattered. After the service, our home filled with neighbors bringing casseroles, former clients sharing memories, and colleagues offering support during the transition. Marcus was gracious and helpful, thanking visitors, organizing food donations, and handling the dozens of sympathy cards that arrived daily. He seemed transformed by the experience, more mature, more connected to the community that had raised him. The next morning changed everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee, still in my bathrobe, when Marcus appeared in the doorway dressed in one of his expensive Manhattan suits. He was holding a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, cold and businesslike, completely devoid of the grief we'd shared just hours earlier. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice taking on the tone he probably used in corporate boardrooms. "I've been reviewing Dad's affairs, and we have some decisions to make about your future." I set down my coffee mug, something cold settling in my stomach. "What kind of decisions?" He opened the folder and spread documents across our kitchen table, the same table where Thomas and I had shared 43 years of morning conversations. "The house, the business, everything is more complicated than you probably realize. Dad made some questionable financial decisions in his final years, and frankly, maintaining this lifestyle isn't sustainable for someone in your position." "My position?" I repeated, not understanding. Marcus pulled out what looked like an Eviction notice. Official legal documents with my name printed across the top. Mom, I need you to understand that this house is now part of Dad's estate, which I'm managing as executor. The business assets, the property, the investments, everything needs to be liquidated to settle debts and maximize value for the beneficiaries. I stared at the papers, my husband not even 48 hours in the ground, and my son was serving me eviction papers in my own kitchen. Marcus, this is my home. Our home. What are you talking about? It's time to downsize, Mom, he said. His voice gentle but firm, as if he were explaining basic math to a child. You're 71 years old. You don't need a 5-bedroom house with property taxes you can't afford on a Social Security income. I've found a lovely assisted living community about an hour from here. They have activity programs, healthcare services, everything you'll need as you age. The words hit me like physical blows. Assisted living, downsizing, as I age. This was my son talking about me like I was already halfway to the grave, incompetent to manage my own life just because my husband had died. I don't understand, I said slowly. Thomas and I owned this house for 40 years. We paid off the mortgage in 1995. The business, everything we built together. How can you just decide to liquidate it? Marcus sighed, the sound of someone dealing with an unreasonable person. Mom, I know this is emotional for you, but you have to think practically. Dad left significant debts. The business has been declining for years. You don't have the expertise to run an estate planning practice, and frankly, most of the clients will probably find new attorneys anyway now that Dad's gone. Each word was carefully calculated to make me feel helpless, dependent, irrelevant. But I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was a woman who had helped build this business from nothing, who knew every client personally, who understood the intricate details of hundreds of families' financial arrangements. I was also a woman who had watched my husband spend his final months carefully protecting something Marcus didn't even know existed. Where am I supposed to go while you're liquidating my life? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. I've arranged temporary housing at Sunset Manor, he said, sliding another document across the table. It's just 20 minutes away, very nice accommodations. You can take whatever personal items fit in their standard apartment layout. The rest will be sold with the house contents. I looked at my son, this stranger in an expensive suit, and realized that grief hadn't transformed him at all. It had simply given him the opportunity to reveal who he'd always been underneath the veneer of family loyalty. He'd spent Thomas's final weeks not bonding with his father, but positioning himself to seize control of everything we'd built the moment Thomas couldn't protect it anymore. I need time to process this, I said quietly. Of course, Marcus replied, gathering up the papers with practiced efficiency. You have 72 hours to make arrangements. The moving truck will be here Friday morning to collect anything you're keeping. I've already spoken with Sunset Manor, and they're expecting you Friday afternoon. He stood up, straightening, his tie like he'd just concluded a successful business meeting. Mom, I know this seems harsh, but I'm doing this for your own good. You'll be much happier in a structured environment with people your own age. And financially, this is the only responsible option. After he left for what he called business meetings, but what I suspected were appointments with real estate agents and liquidation companies, I sat alone in my kitchen surrounded by sympathy cards from people whose lives Thomas and I had touched. Cards expressing gratitude for our kindness, our integrity, our willingness to put families first. That's when I remembered what Thomas had spent those final weeks preparing for. I walked to his study, our home office where we'd worked side by side for so many years. Everything looked normal, but I knew exactly where to look. Behind the bookshelf containing 40 years of legal reference materials was a small safe that Marcus had never known about. Inside was a file labeled Eleanor's Insurance in Thomas's careful handwriting. The documents inside that file would change everything. Because what Marcus didn't know What I hadn't told him during his carefully orchestrated presentation about my financial reality was that Thomas had seen this coming years ago. My brilliant husband had spent our last months together not just fighting cancer, but constructing the most elegant legal trap I'd ever seen. Marcus thought he was inheriting a small-town estate planning practice and a middle-class family home. What he was actually inheriting was about to become his worst nightmare. Because the woman he was trying to force into assisted living wasn't just a grieving widow. She was the secret owner of the most valuable commercial property in Millbrook, the holder of detailed financial records on half the wealthy families in Connecticut, and the beneficiary of trusts so carefully constructed that his law degree from Columbia couldn't begin to unravel them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you about the 3 phone calls I made that afternoon, while Marcus was probably measuring our living room for his real estate listing. Because my son was about to learn the hardest lesson of his privileged life, that some mothers raise children and some mothers raise adversaries, and he'd just forced me to choose which one I was going to be. The first call was to Patricia Morrison, senior partner at Morrison, Blake & Associates, the largest law firm in Hartford. Patricia had been Thomas's law school classmate, and more importantly, she'd been the beneficiary of our estate planning services when her own mother died 5 years ago. Thomas had saved her family approximately $2 million in estate taxes through careful trust structuring, and Patricia had never forgotten the personal attention we'd given her during that difficult time. Eleanor? Patricia's voice was warm but concerned. I was so sorry to hear about Thomas. He was one of the finest attorneys I've ever known. How are you holding up? I'm managing, Patricia, but I need your help with something urgent. Could we meet tomorrow? I have a situation that requires immediate legal attention. Of course. Would you prefer to come to Hartford, or should I drive to Millbrook? Millbrook would be better. I have documents you'll need to see, and I'd rather discuss this privately. The second call was to Jonathan Pierce, president of Millbrook Community Bank, where Thomas and I had maintained both personal and business accounts for over 30 years. Jonathan's family had been our clients since he was in elementary school, and we'd helped his parents establish the trust that eventually allowed him to attend Yale without student loans. Mrs. Whitmore, please accept my deepest condolences. Mr. Whitmore was a pillar of this community. Is there anything I can do to help during this transition? Actually, Jonathan, there is. I need to schedule a meeting to review some account details and discuss a business matter. Would tomorrow afternoon work? Absolutely. I'll make sure we have complete privacy. The third call was the most important and the most personal. I dialed a number I'd memorized but rarely used, knowing that the person on the other end represented the culmination of Thomas's final gift to me. Whitmore Asset Management, this is Catherine. Catherine Brennan had been our client for 15 years, ever since her husband died in a construction accident, and left her with 3 young children and a struggling landscaping business. Thomas had helped her navigate the insurance settlements, establish educational trusts for her children, and structure her business for maximum tax efficiency. What started as a small landscaping company had grown into one of the most successful property management firms in Connecticut, handling commercial, real estate for dozens of major clients. More importantly, Catherine had been holding something for me, something Thomas had arranged 2 years ago when his cancer diagnosis first forced him to confront his mortality. Something that would transform me from a grieving widow being evicted by her own son into the most powerful property owner in Millbrook. Catherine, it's Eleanor Whitmore. I think it's time. Oh, Eleanor, I've been waiting for your call. Thomas made me promise to keep this confidential until you were ready. Should I bring the documents to you, or would you prefer to meet at my office? Your office would be perfect, tomorrow evening, after business hours. I'll be there. Eleanor, what Thomas set up for you, it's brilliant. Your son has no idea what he's just walked into. That night, I sat in the study Thomas and I had shared, Surrounded by 4 decades of memories and the tools we'd used to protect hundreds of families from exactly the kind of predatory behavior my own son was now displaying. The irony wasn't lost on me that the expertise we'd developed to shield clients from greedy relatives was about to be turned against my own child. I opened Thomas's final letter to me, the one he'd written during his last week, and asked me to read only after. He was gone. His handwriting was shaky from the medication, but his message was crystal clear. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the challenges we discussed. Marcus has shown us who he really is, and I've spent our final months ensuring you have everything you need to protect yourself and preserve what we've built together. The documents Catherine is holding will give you options Marcus can't imagine. Use them wisely, but don't hesitate to use them completely if necessary. You are stronger, smarter, and more capable than our son has ever realized. Show him exactly what he's chosen to fight against. All my love, Thomas. Friday morning arrived with Marcus appearing at my door with 2 moving men and a clipboard full of efficiency. He was dressed for success, ready to oversee my transition from homeowner to assisted living resident with the same professional detachment he probably brought to corporate restructuring. Mom, I hope you're ready. The crew needs to start loading. Your approved items so we can get you settled at Sunset Manor by afternoon. I was ready, but not in the way he expected. I was dressed in my best suit, the navy blue one I wore to important client meetings, and I was carrying a briefcase that contained documents that would redefine our entire relationship. Actually, Marcus, I have some meetings this morning. We'll need to postpone the move. His practiced smile faltered slightly. Mom, we can't postpone. I have buyers coming to look at the house this weekend, and Sunset Manor is expecting you today. Everything's arranged. Then I suppose you'll need to rearrange everything. I met his eyes directly, and for the first time since Thomas's funeral, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. Because I won't be moving today. Or any day for that matter. Mom, we discussed this. You can't stay here. It's not financially viable, and frankly, it's not safe for someone your age to live, alone in a house this size. I smiled, the same calm smile Thomas used to give opposing counsel right before he destroyed their arguments with facts they hadn't considered. Marcus, you've made a lot of assumptions about my financial situation and my legal options. Before you make any more permanent decisions, you might want to review some documents your father left in my care. Something in my tone must have penetrated his corporate confidence, because he dismissed the moving men and followed me into the study. I opened the briefcase and spread out papers across Thomas's desk, the same desk where we'd counseled hundreds of families about protecting their assets from exactly this kind of situation. The first document was the deed to 47 Commercial Street, downtown Millbrook's most valuable property, which housed 6 businesses including the town's only upscale restaurant, a boutique law firm, and a medical practice. The deed was in my name, only purchased through a trust Thomas had established in 1995. The second document was the incorporation papers for Whitmore Holdings LLC, showing me as the sole owner of a company that had been quietly acquiring commercial real estate in Millbrook for over 20 years. The third document was a management agreement showing that Catherine Brennan's firm had been overseeing my properties, collecting rents, and depositing proceeds into accounts Marcus had never known existed. The fourth document was the will Thomas had actually filed with the court, not the version Marcus had apparently been working from. This will left our family home to me outright, along with all business assets, client files, and intellectual property associated with Whitmore Estate, planning services. But the fifth document was the one that made Marcus's face go completely white. It was a financial statement showing that over the past 25 years, while he'd been dismissing our quaint small-town operation, Thomas and I had been quietly building a real estate portfolio worth approximately $12 million. Marcus sank into the chair across from Thomas's desk, staring at documents that completely destroyed every assumption he'd made about my financial vulnerability and his inheritance expectations. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Dad never mentioned any of this. I've been through all his files, all the business records." "No, Marcus. You've been through the files he wanted you to see, the ones that dealt with our daily operations. What you're looking at now are the documents Thomas kept in a separate safe, the one behind the bookshelf you never bothered to examine." I pulled out one more document, this one bearing yesterday's date. "And this is the eviction notice I'm serving on you. You have 72 hours to vacate the guest bedroom and remove all your belongings from my property." The transformation in Marcus's face was extraordinary. Confusion shifted to anger, anger to calculation, calculation to something approaching panic as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "You can't do this," he said, his voice taking on the whining tone I remembered from his childhood tantrums. "I'm the executor of Dad's estate. I have legal authority to make these decisions. Actually, you're the executor of a very small portion of your father's estate. The business equipment, some minor investments, a few personal items. Everything else was either already in my name or transferred to me through trusts that became active the moment Thomas died." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden Thomas and I had planted together 40 years ago. "Marcus, your father and I spent 4 decades protecting families from people exactly like you. Did you really think we wouldn't protect ourselves?" The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of Marcus shuffling through documents, probably looking for some loophole, some angle he could exploit. He wouldn't find one. Thomas had been too thorough, too experienced, too aware of exactly what kind of person our son had become. "What do you want?" Marcus finally asked, his corporate composure completely shattered. I turned back to face him, this stranger who shared my DNA but none of my values. "I want you to leave my house, abandon any claim to my property, and never contact me again unless it's to apologize for the cruelty you showed a grieving widow." "And if I don't?" I smiled again, and this time there was nothing maternal in the expression. "Then you'll discover that your mother learned a few things about destroying people financially during 40 years of protecting clients from predators. I have documentation of every unethical practice you've used in your corporate career, every corner you've cut, every rule you've bent. Patricia Morrison is very interested in reviewing your professional conduct, particularly your recent attempts to defraud an elderly widow." Marcus left that afternoon, taking only the personal belongings he'd brought from Manhattan. He didn't say goodbye, didn't apologize, didn't show any recognition of the pain he'd caused or the damage he'd tried to inflict. He simply loaded his expensive luggage into his rental car and drove away, probably already calculating his next move. But I was ready for whatever came next, because Thomas hadn't just given me financial security. He'd given me something much more valuable. The absolute certainty that I was stronger, smarter, and more capable than anyone who tried to diminish me. That evening, I called Patricia Morrison with an update and a new request. Tomorrow, we would begin the process of establishing the Thomas Whitmore Foundation for Elder Protection, using a portion of my assets to provide legal services for seniors facing financial abuse from family members. Because Marcus had taught me something valuable, even if he'd never intended to. There were probably hundreds of elderly people in our community facing similar situations, children who saw their parents' vulnerabilities as opportunities for profit. And now I had the resources, the expertise, and the motivation to make sure those predators faced consequences. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This isn't one of those stories. Some betrayals cut too deep, reveal character flaws too fundamental to overlook or excuse. When your own child tries to exploit your grief for financial gain, when they're willing to destroy your security and independence for their own profit, forgiveness becomes complicity. My son made his choice the morning he handed me eviction, papers in my own kitchen. I made mine when I discovered that his father had given me everything I needed to fight back. And tomorrow, I would begin showing other families exactly how to protect themselves from the predators who should have been their protectors. The woman Marcus tried to force into assisted living was gone forever. In her place stood someone much more dangerous. A mother who'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the cruelty of those who should know better. The morning after Marcus left, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt since before Thomas's diagnosis. Sunlight streamed through our bedroom windows, illuminating the space that my son had tried to force me to abandon just days earlier. But this wasn't the same grieving widow who had been served eviction papers in her own kitchen. This was a woman who had rediscovered her power. My first stop was Catherine Brennan's office, where the full scope of Thomas's protective strategy would finally be revealed. Catherine had been waiting for this moment for 2 years, holding documents that would transform my understanding of everything my husband had quietly arranged during his final months. Catherine's property management firm occupied the entire second floor of the building I apparently owned on Commercial Street. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been paying rent to myself for office space without even knowing it. When I arrived, Catherine was waiting with a conference table covered in manila folders, each one representing a different piece of the financial fortress Thomas had built around me. "Eleanor, I've been looking forward to this conversation for months," Catherine said, embracing me warmly. "Thomas made me promise to wait until you were ready, but what he created for you is absolutely brilliant. He said you'd need time to grieve before you could fully appreciate the gift he was leaving you." She opened the first folder, revealing property deeds I'd never seen before. "This is the Millbrook Plaza development, those 12 retail units, on Elm Street. You've owned them for 8 years. The monthly rental income alone is $38,000. She opened another folder. "The medical complex on Riverside Drive, 6 units, all occupied by specialists and dental practices. Monthly income, $42,000. My hands trembled as I reviewed document after document. Thomas had been quietly building an empire while I'd focused on our daily practice, creating streams of income that would ensure I'd never be financially vulnerable to anyone, including our own son. "But here's the masterpiece," Catherine continued, opening a thick folder marked Phase 3 Implementation. "Thomas purchased the entire block where Sunset Manor sits. You know, that assisted living facility Marcus was so eager to move you into? You own it. He was essentially trying to force you to pay rent to yourself while giving up your family home." The beautiful irony of it took my breath away. Marcus had researched assisted living facilities, toured Sunset Manor, and made arrangements for my residency, never knowing that every dollar of rent would have flowed directly back to me. My husband's sense of poetic justice had extended even to his son's attempts at manipulation. "There's more," Catherine said, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "Thomas also purchased significant stakes in 3 other assisted living facilities across Connecticut. If Marcus had succeeded in forcing you out of your home, you would have become one of the state's largest providers of senior housing while living in a facility you secretly owned." I thought about Marcus's condescending speech about downsizing, about finding me a lovely assisted living community where I could be around people my own age. He'd been so confident in his superior knowledge, so certain that I was financially helpless without him. Meanwhile, his father had been positioning me to become one of the most powerful real estate investors in the region. "Catherine, how long have you known about all this?" "Thomas brought me in about 3 years ago, right after Marcus's first visit where he suggested selling the practice. Thomas said he could see what was coming, that Marcus viewed you both as obstacles to his inheritance rather than parents deserving respect. So he started planning." She pulled out a timeline Thomas had created, documenting every conversation with Marcus, every suggestion about modernizing or downsizing, every comment that revealed his true priorities. My husband had been building a case against our own son's character, preparing for exactly the scenario that had unfolded after his death. He said something I'll never forget, Catherine continued. Marcus thinks he's smarter than two people who've spent 40 years outsmarting greedy relatives. He's about to discover how wrong he is. The next folder contained correspondence between Thomas and Patricia Morrison, revealing that my husband had been documenting Marcus's professional conduct for over 2 years. Every questionable business practice, every ethical shortcut, every corporate maneuver that existed in legal gray areas had been carefully cataloged and cross-referenced with Bar Association guidelines. Eleanor, your husband wasn't just protecting your financial security. He was building the foundation for destroying Marcus professionally if he ever tried to harm you. I spent 3 hours reviewing documents that revealed the extent of Thomas's protective planning. He'd anticipated every possible angle Marcus might pursue, every legal challenge he might mount, every manipulation he might attempt. My husband had turned his final years into a chess game, positioning pieces Marcus couldn't even see. But the most surprising revelation came in the final folder. Thomas established a private investigation account 2 years ago, Catherine explained. He hired professionals to monitor Marcus's activities in New York, his business dealings, his personal relationships. What they found is illuminating. The investigation had revealed that Marcus's sudden interest in our declining business hadn't been motivated by filial concern. His Manhattan firm was facing serious financial difficulties following several failed acquisitions and a class action lawsuit related to pension fund mismanagement. Marcus himself was deeply in debt, living far beyond his means in an expensive apartment he couldn't afford, maintaining a lifestyle funded by credit cards and personal loans. He needed money desperately, Catherine said. The inheritance he was counting on wasn't just greed, it was desperation. His plan was to liquidate everything quickly, use the proceeds to cover his debts, and hopefully salvage his career before his firm discovered the extent of his financial problems. This information reframed everything about Marcus's behavior in the weeks before and after Thomas's death. His sudden devotion, his helpful assistance with business matters, his careful preparation for my transition hadn't been motivated by love or concern. He'd been conducting reconnaissance, gathering information he could use to expedite the liquidation of assets he assumed he'd inherit. Thomas knew all of this? I asked. Every detail. He said it broke his heart, but it also made his decision easier. He told me, I raised a son who became a stranger. Now I need to protect my wife from that stranger. My second meeting that day was with Patricia Morrison at her Hartford law firm. Patricia had driven to Millbrook personally, bringing 2 associates and a litigation strategy that would make Marcus's corporate training look like amateur hour. Eleanor, I've reviewed everything Thomas prepared, and I have to say, this is some of the most comprehensive protective planning I've ever seen, Patricia said as we settled into her conference room. But beyond the financial aspects, we need to discuss the criminal elements of what Marcus attempted. She spread out legal documents with the efficiency of someone accustomed to high-stakes litigation. What Marcus did to you constitutes elder abuse under Connecticut law. The eviction papers he served, the pressure tactics he used, the attempts to force you into assisted living against your will, all of this creates grounds for criminal charges. But he's my son, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Eleanor, that makes it worse, not better. The law recognizes that financial abuse by family members is particularly damaging because it exploits relationships built on trust. We can pursue criminal charges, civil remedies, or both. She opened another file. We also have the professional misconduct angle. Marcus used his legal training to create fraudulent documents, misrepresented his authority as executor, and attempted to coerce you into decisions that would have benefited him financially. The Connecticut Bar Association takes a very dim view of attorneys who abuse elderly family members. Patricia's team had been busy in the 24 hours since I'd contacted her, They'd researched Marcus's firm, his recent cases, his professional standing, and his financial situation. What they'd found painted a picture of a lawyer whose career was already hanging by a thread. His firm is conducting an internal investigation into several questionable transactions, Patricia explained. If we add elder abuse charges to his existing problems, his legal career is essentially over. No firm will touch him, his license will be suspended, and his debt situation will become unsustainable. What are you recommending? Patricia smiled with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case she cared about. Complete destruction. We file criminal charges for elder abuse, petition the Bar Association for professional sanctions, and pursue civil litigation for emotional distress and attempted theft. We don't just defeat Marcus. We make sure he never has the opportunity to harm another elderly person. That seems extreme. Eleanor, what Marcus did to you wasn't just cruel. It was predatory. He spent weeks preparing to exploit your grief, your trust, and your supposed vulnerability. If we don't stop him definitively, he'll find other victims. Probably other elderly clients or relatives who don't have Thomas's foresight to protect them. That afternoon, I drove to the offices of Whitmore Estate Planning Services for the first time since Thomas's death. Mrs. Chen, our longtime secretary, was there organizing client files and managing the dozens of sympathy calls and condolence visits we'd received. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so glad to see you," she said, embracing me with genuine warmth. "I wasn't sure what would happen to the practice. Marcus told me last week that everything would be liquidated and that I should start looking for new employment." "Marcus had no authority to make those decisions," I said firmly. "This practice belongs to me now, and you belong here for as long as you want to stay." The relief on Mrs. Chen's face reminded me that Marcus's attempted takeover had affected more than just my security. Our employees, our clients, our entire professional community had been destabilized by his assumptions and his demands. Restoring the practice wasn't just about my independence. It was about preserving something that served dozens of families who depended on our expertise and our integrity. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing client files and returning phone calls from families who were concerned about the continuity of our services. Each conversation reminded me why Thomas and I had dedicated our lives to this work, and why Marcus's plans to liquidate everything had been so fundamentally wrong. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow we'd helped for free, called to ask if the rumors about the practice closing were true. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mrs. Whitmore. You and Thomas saved my house when the lawyers tried to take it during probate." The Rodriguez family stopped by in person, bringing flowers and expressing concerns about their ongoing estate planning needs. "You helped us rebuild after the fire," Mr. Rodriguez said. "We trust you with our family's future." By closing time, I'd received similar calls and visits from 37 different clients, each one representing a family whose security depended on the services Marcus had been so eager to eliminate. These weren't just abstract business relationships. They were people whose lives would have been genuinely harmed by his liquidation plans. That evening, I had dinner with Catherine and Patricia to discuss our coordinated strategy. We met at the restaurant in the Commercial Street building I owned, where Catherine had reserved a private dining room for our conversation. "Marcus is going to fight back," Patricia warned. "When he realizes the scope of what he's lost and the legal jeopardy he's facing, he'll probably become desperate. Desperate people make dangerous decisions." "What kind of dangers are we talking about?" I asked. "He might try to contest Thomas's estate planning, claim you manipulated a dying man or that the documents are fraudulent. He might attempt to access your properties through shell companies or legal technicalities. He might even try to damage your reputation in the community, claiming you're mentally incompetent or financially irresponsible." Catherine nodded agreement. "I've seen it before with property disputes. When someone realizes they've lost everything they thought they'd inherit, they sometimes escalate dramatically rather than accepting defeat gracefully. So we need to be prepared for a war, not just a battle," I said. Exactly, Patricia replied. But here's the advantage we have. Thomas prepared for war. Every document is bulletproof. Every transaction is documented. Every potential challenge has been anticipated and countered. Marcus is fighting with assumptions and desperation. We're fighting with facts and preparation. We spent 2 hours developing what Patricia called a overwhelming force strategy. Rather than responding defensively to Marcus's challenges, we would launch a comprehensive offensive that would eliminate his ability to mount any meaningful resistance. First, we file all criminal and civil charges simultaneously, Patricia explained. Elder abuse, fraud, professional misconduct, emotional distress. We don't give him time to prepare defenses. We hit him with everything at once. Second, we contact his firm and his creditors with evidence of his financial desperation and questionable judgment, Catherine added. We make sure his professional and personal support systems understand exactly what kind of person they're dealing with. Third, we go public, Patricia continued. The local newspaper, the Bar Association newsletter, the community organizations you've served for 40 years. We tell the story of a devoted son who tried to steal his grieving mother's home the day after his father's funeral. The strategy was comprehensive, ruthless, and completely justified. Marcus had declared war on his own family. We were simply responding with superior tactics and overwhelming resources. There's one more element, I said, thinking about all the client families who had expressed concern about the practice's future. I want to establish a legal aid fund for elderly people facing family financial abuse. We use this experience to help other families in similar situations. Patricia's eyes lit up. That's brilliant. We turn your personal justice into a broader, social mission. It shows the community that this isn't just about revenge, it's about protection and prevention. Catherine pulled out her phone and started taking notes. I can structure the fund through your property holdings, create a sustainable income stream that provides legal services in perpetuity. Thomas would have loved that. Over dessert, we refined the details of what would become the Thomas Whitmore Elder Protection Initiative. The fund would provide free legal services to seniors facing financial abuse, educational workshops on estate planning and asset protection, and advocacy for stronger laws protecting elderly people from predatory family members. How do we announce this? I asked. At the press conference where we reveal Marcus's charges, Patricia said with satisfaction. We show the community that his attempt to harm you has inspired a permanent solution to protect other families. Walking home that night, I passed the house where Marcus had grown up, where Thomas and I had raised what we thought was a child with character and integrity. The windows were dark now, empty of the life and warmth that had once filled those rooms. Tomorrow, those windows would stay dark, because the son who had tried to steal this home would never be welcome here again. But as I climbed the front, steps Thomas had built with his own hands 40 years ago, I realized that this house wasn't empty at all. It was full of the love we'd shared, the clients we'd served, the community we'd protected, and the legacy we'd built together. Marcus had tried to reduce all of that to a real estate transaction, but he'd failed completely. My phone rang as I settled into the study for my evening planning session. The caller ID showed a New York number I didn't recognize. Mom, it's Marcus. We need to talk. His voice was different than it had been during his brief and humiliating departure the day before. The corporate confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. I don't think we have anything to discuss, I replied calmly. I've been thinking about what happened, and I think there was a misunderstanding. Maybe we can work something out that benefits everyone. Marcus, the only misunderstanding was mine. I thought I'd raised a son with character. Yesterday proved me wrong. Mom, please. I know I made mistakes, but I was under a lot of pressure. My firm has been having problems, and I thought I was doing what was best for both of us. There it was, the confession that his entire plan had been motivated by his own financial desperation, not any concern for my welfare. Even his apology was really an admission of guilt. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want to come home and start over. We can rebuild the practice together, modernize it like I suggested. I can move back to Millbrook and we can be a family again." The audacity was breathtaking. After serving me eviction papers and trying to force me into assisted living, he was now proposing a partnership as if nothing had happened. "Marcus, yesterday you told me I was too old and incompetent to manage my own life. Today you want to be my business partner. Which version of me is the real one in your mind?" "I was wrong yesterday. I was scared and I made bad decisions. But I'm your son. Family has to count for something." "You're right. Family does count for something. That's why what you did was so unforgivable." I hung up before he could respond, but his call had confirmed what Patricia and Catherine had predicted. Marcus was going to escalate, not retreat. His financial situation was apparently so desperate that he was willing to humiliate himself with a transparently manipulative apology rather than accept the consequences of his actions. That night, I drafted letters to be delivered the next morning. Letters that would begin the process of teaching my son exactly what happened when someone tried to exploit Eleanor Whitmore's grief for profit. Letters that would transform this personal betrayal into a public example of what happens when predators choose the wrong victim. The first letter went to the district attorney's office, formally requesting criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. The second went to the Connecticut Bar Association requesting immediate investigation of Marcus's professional conduct. The third went to his Manhattan firm, informing them of his recent activities and suggesting they might want to review his other client relationships. The fourth letter was different. It went to the editor of the Millbrook Gazette, requesting a meeting to discuss a community initiative that would protect other families from the kind of predatory behavior I had experienced. Because Marcus had taught me something valuable, even though he hadn't intended to. He'd shown me that my skills, my resources, and my community connections weren't just personal assets. They were tools that could protect other vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation he had attempted. Tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. But tonight, I sat in the study Thomas and I had shared, surrounded by 40 years of memories and protected by the love of a husband who had anticipated everything. Marcus thought he was fighting a grieving widow. He was actually fighting the combined legacy of two people who had spent their entire careers defeating predators exactly like him. The woman he'd tried to force into assisted living was gone forever. In her place was someone much more dangerous, a mother who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of protection is refusing to enable the cruelty of those who should have known better. The war began at precisely 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, when Patricia Morrison's legal team filed a comprehensive package of charges that would forever alter Marcus's understanding of consequences. While he was probably still rehearsing apologies and calculating compromise offers, court clerks were processing documents that would make his corporate law training look like kindergarten finger painting. The Connecticut State Police arrived at Marcus's Manhattan office building at the same time the charges were being filed in Millbrook. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who specialized in elder abuse cases, had worked with our legal team to coordinate the timing for maximum impact on Marcus's professional reputation. We wanted to ensure his colleagues witnessed the investigation firsthand, Patricia explained during our morning strategy session. Nothing destroys a corporate lawyer's credibility faster than being questioned by police in front of clients and partners. The criminal charges were comprehensive: elder abuse in the first degree, fraud by deception, conspiracy to commit theft, and professional misconduct. Each charge carried significant penalties, but more importantly, they created a public record that would follow Marcus for the rest of his career. The beauty of this approach, Patricia continued, is that even if he somehow beats the criminal charges, the professional misconduct allegations will destroy his legal career. The Bar Association doesn't require the same burden of proof as criminal court. While Patricia's team orchestrated the legal assault, Catherine Brennan was implementing the financial component of our strategy. She'd spent the weekend documenting every property transaction, every rental agreement, and every business relationship that demonstrated the scope of assets Marcus had tried to steal. "Eleanor, I've prepared a presentation for the community meeting tonight," Catherine said, spreading photographs across our conference table. "People need to see exactly what he attempted to take from you, and more importantly, what that would have meant for the families who depend on these services." The photographs showed every property in our portfolio: the medical complexes where local doctors served our community, the retail spaces that housed family businesses, the office buildings, where professionals provided essential services. Marcus's liquidation plan wouldn't have just destroyed my security. It would have destabilized the entire economic ecosystem Thomas and I had spent decades nurturing. "This is the story we need to tell," Catherine emphasized. "This wasn't just a greedy son trying to steal his mother's inheritance. This was an outside corporate predator attempting to destroy a community institution for quick profit." The afternoon brought the first signs that our strategy was working more effectively than even Patricia had anticipated. Marcus's law firm released a statement announcing his immediate leave of absence pending resolution of personal legal matters. Corporate speak for, "We're cutting ties before this scandal destroys our reputation." They're distancing themselves faster than I expected, Patricia observed when the news reached us. Marcus must have more professional vulnerabilities than we initially realized. The firm's swift abandonment of Marcus revealed something crucial about his standing in the legal community. He wasn't the successful corporate lawyer he'd portrayed himself as during his condescending speeches about my financial reality. He was apparently expendable enough that his colleagues were willing to sacrifice him immediately to protect themselves. Mrs. Chen brought additional intelligence from her network of connections throughout the legal community. "My sister works for a court reporting service in Hartford," she said. "She heard that Marcus's firm has been under investigation for mishandling client funds. His problems started long before he came after you." This revelation reframed everything about Marcus's desperate attempt to liquidate my assets. He hadn't just been struggling with personal debt. He'd apparently been involved in professional misconduct that threatened his entire career. My inheritance wasn't just a convenient solution to his financial problems. It might have been his last chance to avoid complete professional destruction. "Eleanor, this changes our strategy significantly," Patricia said, after reviewing the new information. "We're not just protecting you from a greedy relative. We're stopping a corrupt lawyer who was using family connections to fund his escape from professional accountability." The evening community meeting at the Millbrook Town Hall drew a crowd that surprised even longtime residents who were accustomed to high attendance at local events. Word had spread through the tight-knit community that Eleanor Whitmore had something important to share about protecting families from financial predators. Mayor Jennifer Wallace introduced me to the packed auditorium with words that reminded everyone of the 4 decades Thomas and I had served our neighbors. "The Whitmores have helped more families in this community than any other professional service. Tonight, Eleanor is going to share information that could protect your own families from similar threats." I stepped to the podium feeling the weight of responsibility that came with transforming personal pain into community protection. These weren't just neighbors and clients. They were families who trusted me with their most sensitive concerns and who deserved to understand the dangers that could threaten their own security. 3 weeks ago, I buried my husband Thomas after 43 years of marriage, I began. The day after his funeral, my son served me eviction papers in my own kitchen and told me it was time to downsize. What happened next taught me important lessons about family betrayal, but more importantly, about the resources we all have to protect ourselves and our communities. I told them about Marcus's calculated manipulation, his attempts to exploit my grief, and his plans to liquidate assets that served dozens of local families. But I also told them about Thomas's protective planning, the hidden resources that gave me options Marcus never imagined, and the legal strategies that had completely reversed his attempted takeover. This experience showed me that financial abuse by family members is more common than most people realize, I continued. Adult children who see their parents' assets as early inheritance, relatives who pressure elderly family members into hasty financial decisions, and professionals who exploit trust for personal gain. The audience was completely silent, absorbing information that many had never considered despite its relevance to their own family situations. I could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the auditorium as people connected my story to their own experiences or concerns. That's why I'm announcing the establishment of the Thomas Whitmore Elder Protection Initiative, a permanent legal aid fund that will provide free services to families facing financial abuse, educational workshops on asset protection, and advocacy for stronger laws protecting our most vulnerable community members. The applause was immediate and sustained, but what moved me most was the number of people who approached afterward with their own stories of family financial manipulation or concerns about protecting elderly relatives from predatory behavior. Margaret Foster, whose mother had recently been pressured by a nephew to change her will, asked about legal resources for families facing similar situations. Robert Chen, Mrs. Chen's brother, shared concerns about his father-in-law being manipulated by a caregiver who had convinced him to make her a beneficiary of his life insurance policy. Eleanor, what you've created here tonight is more than just a legal aid fund, said Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose medical practice occupied space in one of my buildings. You've given this community permission to talk openly about financial abuse and the tools to fight back against it. Each conversation reinforced my conviction that Marcus's attempted exploitation wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern that affected families throughout our community. The legal resources Thomas and I had developed to protect ourselves could serve many more families facing similar threats. Wednesday morning brought news that exceeded even Patricia's most optimistic projections. The Connecticut Attorney General's office announced a statewide investigation into elder financial abuse, citing recent cases that had brought this issue to public attention. While they didn't name Marcus specifically, the timing and details made it clear that our case had triggered much broader scrutiny. Eleanor, what you've done here is extraordinary, said Attorney General Lisa Hamilton during a phone call that afternoon. Your case has exposed patterns of abuse that we've been trying to address for years. Would you be willing to serve as a consultant for our investigation? The request was simultaneously flattering and daunting. Consulting with the state's highest legal office would give me resources to help families far beyond Millbrook, but it would also make this fight much more public and potentially more dangerous. What would that involve? I asked. We want to use your experience as a model for other communities statewide. Your legal strategies, your community organizing approach, and your documentation methods could help us identify and prosecute financial abuse cases across Connecticut. Patricia, who had been listening to the conversation, nodded enthusiastically. Eleanor, this is exactly what Thomas would have wanted. You're transforming personal justice into systemic change. That afternoon brought additional vindication, when Marcus's former colleagues began distancing themselves publicly from his actions. The managing partner of his Manhattan firm released a statement expressing shock and disappointment at the charges against their former associate and emphasizing their commitment to ethical professional conduct. When your own law firm throws you under the bus publicly, your career is essentially over, Patricia observed with satisfaction. No other firm will touch him now, and his professional reputation is permanently destroyed. But the most satisfying development came when Dr. Amanda Reeves, director of Sunset Manor, called to thank me for exposing what she called a deeply troubling pattern of family manipulation. Mrs. Whitmore, we've had several families approach us recently with concerns about relatives who were pressuring elderly family members into unnecessary assisted living arrangements. Dr. Reeves explained. Your son's case has helped us recognize warning signs we might have missed in the past. The irony was perfect. Marcus's attempts to force me into assisted living had actually improved protections for other elderly people facing similar manipulation. His expertise in exploitation had been turned into a training manual for recognizing and preventing exactly the kind of abuse he had attempted. Thursday brought the news I'd been anticipating. Marcus was returning to Millbrook, not as a successful corporate lawyer coming home to claim his inheritance, but as a defendant facing serious criminal charges who needed to appear in court for arraignment. He's hired a local defense attorney, Patricia informed me during our morning briefing. James Morrison, no relation to me despite the name. He's competent enough, but he specializes in DUI cases and minor criminal matters. Marcus either can't afford better representation, or no serious criminal defense attorney will take his case. The choice of attorney revealed how dramatically Marcus's circumstances had deteriorated in just 1 week. The confident corporate lawyer who had served me eviction papers was now apparently struggling to find adequate legal representation for his own defense. James Morrison is a decent enough lawyer for what he usually handles, Patricia continued. But he's never dealt with anything like the case we've built. He's going to be completely outmatched. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Thomas's former law school classmate, Judge Robert Harrison, who would be presiding over Marcus's arraignment. While he couldn't discuss the case details, he wanted to express his condolences and his admiration for the way I'd handled such a difficult situation. Eleanor, Thomas would be proud of how you've turned this betrayal into community protection, Judge Harrison said. Your legal strategy is textbook perfect, and your evidence is overwhelming. But more importantly, you've shown people that abuse has consequences. The community response continued to exceed my expectations. Local business owners were volunteering to sponsor workshops on financial protection for seniors. The library offered space for educational seminars. 3 retired attorneys volunteered to provide pro bono services through the Thomas Whitmore Initiative. What you've created here is remarkable, said Susan Chen, the librarian and Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law. People are talking about financial protection and family communication in ways they never did before. You've changed the conversation about aging and vulnerability in this community. Friday afternoon, I stood in the courtroom where Thomas had practiced law for over 4 decades, watching his son face criminal charges for the behavior Thomas had spent his final months preparing to defeat. Marcus looked smaller somehow, diminished by the circumstances that his own choices had created. His attorney, James Morrison, entered a plea of not guilty to all charges, which Patricia had expected. He's probably hoping to negotiate a plea, deal that avoids jail time, she whispered. But given the evidence we have and the community attention this case has generated, any deal will require full restitution and probably some incarceration. Marcus glanced toward me once during the proceedings, his face showing none of the corporate confidence that had characterized his eviction demands just days earlier. He looked like what he was, a desperate man who had gambled everything on exploiting his mother's grief and lost catastrophically. After the arraignment, reporters from 3 newspapers and 2 television stations requested interviews about the case and the broader issue of elder financial abuse. The story had expanded far beyond Millbrook, attracting attention from advocacy groups and legal organizations throughout New England. Mrs. Whitmore, how do you want families to use your experience to protect themselves? Asked Jennifer Walsh from Channel 8 News. The most important lesson is that preparation matters more than hoping for the best, I replied. Thomas and I spent years documenting our assets, establishing protective trusts, and building relationships with professionals who shared our values. When Marcus tried to exploit our family tragedy, those preparations turned his weapon against us into a shield that protected everything we'd built. That evening, Catherine and I reviewed the financial impact of the week's developments. Not only had we completely defeated Marcus's attempts to liquidate my assets, But the publicity around the case had actually increased the value of several properties in our portfolio. 3 new medical practices have inquired about leasing space in the Riverside complex, Catherine reported. They specifically mentioned being impressed by your commitment to community service and ethical business practices. The retail tenants in the Commercial Street building are organizing a customer appreciation event to show support for local business, she continued. They want to demonstrate that Marcus's liquidation plan would have damaged the entire downtown business district. The week had transformed what began as a personal betrayal into a community rallying point. Marcus's attempts to exploit my vulnerability had instead revealed the strength of the relationships Thomas and I had built over 4 decades of ethical practice and community service. Saturday morning brought a call I hadn't expected from Marcus himself, now speaking from a payphone because his cell service had apparently been discontinued for non-payment. "Mom, I need help," he said, his voice stripped of all pretense and corporate polish. "My firm fired me. My creditors are demanding payment, and my lawyer says the charges against me could result in 5 years in prison." "Marcus, you created this situation through your own choices. I didn't file false charges or fabricate evidence. Everything you're facing is the consequence of what you tried to do to me. I know I made mistakes, but I'm your son. Doesn't that count for anything?" Yesterday it might have. But you chose to see me as a target rather than your mother. You spent weeks planning to exploit my grief and steal my security. Those weren't mistakes, Marcus. They were calculated decisions. What do you want me to do? I've lost everything. Learn from this. Accept responsibility for your actions. Make different choices in whatever future you manage to build. And you'll drop the charges? Marcus, this stopped being about you the moment I realized how many other families face similar threats. The charges stand, the investigation continues, and the Thomas Whitmore Initiative will ensure other families have the resources to protect themselves from people exactly like you. I hung up before he could respond, but his call had confirmed something important. The man who had tried to force me into assisted living was now the one facing an uncertain future, dependent on others for basic necessities, stripped of the security and status he'd taken for granted. Sunday evening, I sat in the study Thomas and I had shared, surrounded by letters from families throughout Connecticut who had heard about our case and wanted to share their own experiences with financial abuse or express gratitude for bringing this issue into public discussion. A widow from Hartford wrote about her daughter's attempts to force her to sell her home and move into a facility where she'd have no independence. A retired teacher from New Haven described her son-in-law's pressure to make him beneficiary of her retirement accounts. An elderly farmer from Waterbury told about relatives who tried to convince him to transfer his property to them for tax purposes. Each letter reinforced my conviction that Marcus's attempted exploitation was part of a much larger problem that affected families throughout our region. The legal strategies Thomas had developed to protect us could help many more families facing similar predators. But the letter that moved me most came from Sarah Martinez, a social worker who specialized in elder abuse cases. "Mrs. Whitmore, your case has changed how we approach family financial abuse investigations. Your documentation methods, your legal strategies, and your community organizing approach have given us tools we didn't have before. More importantly, you've shown victims that they have options beyond simply enduring exploitation." That night, I drafted letters to 3 law schools, offering to establish internship programs that would give students experience in elder protection law while providing free services to families who couldn't afford private attorneys. The Thomas Whitmore Initiative was expanding beyond what I'd originally envisioned, becoming a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The woman Marcus had tried to force into assisted living was transforming into something he could never have anticipated. A state-recognized expert in elder protection, a community organizer who had turned personal betrayal into systemic change, and an advocate whose resources and influence grew stronger every day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Marcus's legal situation continued to deteriorate and our protective initiatives expanded throughout Connecticut. But tonight, I sat in the home he'd tried to steal, surrounded by the legacy Thomas and I had built together and protected by the community that valued our decades of service. Marcus had taught me something valuable, though he'd never intended to. He'd shown me that strength isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about using your resources and experience to protect others facing similar threats. The mother he'd tried to exploit had become the advocate he'd never expected, and the consequences of his choices were rippling far beyond anything he'd imagined when he handed me those eviction papers in my own kitchen. 6 months after Marcus handed me eviction papers in my own kitchen, I stood before the Connecticut State Legislature as they voted unanimously to pass the Elder Financial Protection Act, comprehensive legislation that would transform how our state addressed family-based financial abuse. The bill, which legal experts were calling the most progressive elder protection law in the nation, had emerged directly from the legal strategies Thomas and I had developed and the community response Marcus's betrayal had generated. The Honorable Eleanor Whitmore has shown us that individual courage can become systemic change, announced Representative Maria Santos as she introduced me to the legislative gallery. Her experience has given Connecticut the roadmap for protecting our most vulnerable citizens from the very people who should be their greatest protectors. The journey from victim to state-recognized advocate had been extraordinary, but it was the faces in the gallery that made this moment truly meaningful. Dozens of families who had used the Thomas Whitmore Initiative's services were there to witness the culmination of work that had begun with my husband's protective planning and had grown into a movement that was changing lives across New England. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow whose house we'd saved from predatory relatives, sat in the front row holding a photograph of her late husband. Eleanor didn't just save my home, she had told a reporter earlier. She saved my dignity and showed me that being older doesn't mean being powerless. The legislation included provisions that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions when they suspected elder abuse, enhanced penalties for family members who exploited elderly relatives, and state funding for legal aid programs modeled on our community initiative. But the most significant provision was the Eleanor Whitmore Emergency Protection Protocol, which allowed elderly victims of family financial abuse to obtain immediate court protection while criminal investigations proceeded. No longer would people like me have to fight back alone while their security was being systematically destroyed. This law will prevent thousands of families from experiencing what the Whitmores endured, said Attorney General Lisa Hamilton during the post-vote press conference. But more importantly, it establishes the principle that financial abuse of elderly family members is not a private matter. It's a crime that demands public accountability. The transformation of my personal nightmare into groundbreaking legislation had attracted national attention. The Thomas Whitmore Initiative was being studied by advocacy groups in 12 states. 3 universities had established research programs based on our documentation methods, and the American Bar Association had asked me to develop training materials for attorneys handling elder abuse cases. Dr. Amanda Reeves from Sunset Manor had become one of our most effective allies, using her position in the assisted living industry to identify and report suspicious family behavior that might indicate financial manipulation. Eleanor's case taught us to look beyond the surface when families suddenly decide their elderly relatives need immediate placement, she explained to a conference of healthcare professionals. Now we ask harder questions and document concerning patterns. The ripple effects extended far beyond Connecticut. Legal aid organizations throughout New England were implementing our model. Law schools were adding elder protection courses to their curricula, and state legislatures in Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine were considering similar legislation. Marcus's case had concluded 3 months earlier with a plea agreement that included 3 years of supervised probation, full restitution for the emotional distress and legal costs his actions had caused, and permanent surrender of his law license. His attorney had negotiated desperately to avoid jail time, but the community impact of his attempted exploitation had made lenient treatment impossible. Mr. Whitmore's actions represented more than individual greed, Judge Harrison had stated during sentencing. They demonstrated a pattern of professional and personal conduct that threatens the safety and security of elderly citizens throughout our community. This sentence reflects both accountability for past actions and deterrence for future predators. Marcus had left Connecticut immediately after sentencing, relocating to Arizona where he was attempting to rebuild his life without the professional credentials and family connections he had taken for granted. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working in construction, living in a small apartment, and struggling with debt that would follow him for years. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but I felt tremendous pride in what his attempted exploitation had inspired. The legal protections we'd developed were helping families across multiple states. The community education programs were preventing financial abuse before it occurred, and the advocacy networks were giving elderly people tools they'd never had before. The most rewarding aspect of this transformation was the direct impact on individual families. Through the Thomas Whitmore Initiative, we'd provided legal services to over 200 families facing financial manipulation, prevented the forced sale of dozens of family homes, and recovered more than $3 million in assets that predatory relatives had attempted to steal. Mrs. Chen had become our program coordinator, using her decades of experience in legal administration to develop systems that could be replicated in other communities. Eleanor showed us that fighting back isn't just about individual justice, she often told families seeking our help. It's about creating a world where elder abuse has consequences and protection has resources. Catherine Brennan had expanded her property management firm to include specialized services for elderly property owners, helping them protect their assets through careful documentation and professional oversight. What Thomas and Eleanor created wasn't just financial security, she explained to a conference of estate planning professionals. It was a model for turning personal expertise into community protection. The success of our initiative had attracted partnerships with organizations I'd never imagined working with. The AARP had provided funding for educational workshops. 3 major banks had implemented training programs based on our financial abuse detection methods, and the National Association of Social Workers had adopted our documentation protocols for elder abuse investigations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Connecticut Bar Association, the same organization that had stripped Marcus of his license, established the Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore Award for Excellence in Elder Advocacy, recognizing attorneys who demonstrated exceptional commitment to protecting elderly clients from financial exploitation. This award honors not just professional competence, but moral courage, said Bar Association President Robert Mitchell during the inaugural ceremony. The Whitmores showed us that legal expertise combined with community commitment can transform individual tragedy into lasting protection for our most vulnerable citizens. The first recipient was Patricia Morrison, whose legal strategy had not only defeated Marcus's exploitation, but had created the framework for legislation that was protecting families throughout the region. Eleanor taught me that sometimes the greatest legal victory isn't winning a case, Patricia said in her acceptance speech. It's creating a world where similar cases become impossible. As winter turned to spring in the year following Thomas's death, I found myself living a life neither of us could have imagined when he was making his protective plans. The house Marcus had tried to steal had become the headquarters for an advocacy organization that was changing elder protection law across New England. The business he'd attempted to liquidate was thriving, serving more families than ever while providing the financial foundation for our expanded mission. The study where Thomas and I had worked together for 4 decades now hosted strategy sessions with legislators, training workshops for social workers, and planning meetings for initiatives that were spreading our model to communities across the country. The love we'd shared in that room had grown into something larger, a legacy that was protecting families we'd never meet in places we'd never see. My daily routine had evolved from managing a local estate planning practice to consulting with state agencies, speaking at national conferences, and developing policies that would protect elderly people for generations to come. The woman Marcus had seen as a helpless widow had become someone whose influence extended far beyond anything I'd achieved during my decades in private practice. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Managing a growing advocacy organization while maintaining our local legal services required skills I'd never needed before. Media attention brought both support and scrutiny that tested my comfort with public visibility. The emotional demands of working with families facing betrayal, similar to what I'd experienced, could be exhausting. But every challenge was overshadowed by the knowledge that our work was preventing other families from enduring what Marcus had tried to inflict on me. Each successful case, each prevented exploitation, each family that maintained their security and dignity represented Thomas's protective planning multiplied across hundreds of lives. Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose medical practice occupied space in one of my buildings, had become one of our most effective partners in identifying potential financial abuse through changes in elderly patients' behavior or circumstances. Eleanor's experience taught us to look for warning signs we'd never noticed before, she explained to a medical conference. Now we document concerning family dynamics and connect families with protective resources before crisis situations develop. The success of our community-based model had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. 3 Fortune 500 companies had implemented employee assistance programs based on our educational materials, recognizing that financial abuse of elderly family members affected their workers' productivity and well-being. 2 insurance companies had developed policies that included elder protection services as standard benefits. The national recognition reached its peak when the White House Conference on Aging invited me to serve on their advisory committee for elder protection policy. The woman who had been served eviction papers by her own son was now helping to shape federal policy that would protect millions of elderly Americans from similar exploitation. Mrs. Whitmore represents the transformation of personal experience into public service at its finest, said the conference director during my introduction. Her journey from victim to advocate demonstrates that individual courage can become systemic change when it's grounded in expertise, community support, and unwavering commitment to justice. During my testimony before the conference, I shared the story of Thomas's protective planning, Marcus's attempted exploitation, and the community response that had grown into a national model. But I also shared the stories of families we'd helped, the legislation we'd inspired, and the future we were building where elder abuse would face immediate and comprehensive consequences. The greatest lesson I've learned is that vulnerability can become strength when it's transformed into advocacy, I concluded. Thomas and I spent 40 years protecting individual families. His legacy is now protecting families across the country, and that protection will continue long after I'm gone. The standing ovation from policymakers, advocates, and family representatives from across the nation was gratifying. But the real validation came from the families whose lives had been changed by our work. Letters arrived daily from elderly people who had used our resources to protect themselves, from adult children who had learned to recognize predatory behavior in their own families, and from communities that had implemented our model to create their own protective networks. Sarah Williams, a widow from Vermont who had used our legal strategies to defeat her stepson's attempts to steal her farm, wrote, "Eleanor showed me that being alone doesn't mean being helpless. The tools you developed saved my family's land and my independence. Now I'm teaching other women in my community how to protect themselves." Robert Chen, whose family had attended our community meeting that first night, had become a volunteer, advocate helping elderly immigrants navigate complex financial protection challenges. "Mrs. Whitmore proved that individual action can create community change," he said. "Our family learned to protect my father-in-law, and now we're helping other families avoid the same threats." The most powerful testimony came from Jessica Martinez, a young attorney who had joined our legal team after witnessing how elder abuse had devastated her own grandmother. Eleanor transformed tragedy into triumph in a way that's changing how our entire profession approaches elder protection, she said. She showed us that sometimes the most important legal victory is preventing the case from happening at all. As the first anniversary of Thomas's death approached, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from grieving widow to national advocate. The pain of losing my husband would never completely fade, but it had been transformed into something meaningful, something that honored his memory while protecting countless other families. The house where Marcus had served me eviction papers now hosted delegations from other states studying our model. The kitchen table where he'd spread those cruel documents was now where we planned initiatives that were changing elder protection laws across the country. The study where Thomas had prepared his protective strategy was now where we developed policies that would protect generations of families. On the evening before the anniversary of Thomas's death, I sat in his chair overlooking the garden we'd planted together, reading letters from families whose lives had been changed by the work his planning had made possible. A sunset painted the sky in colors that reminded me of the morning he'd died, when everything had seemed hopeless and uncertain. My phone rang with a call I'd been expecting, but dreading. Marcus's number appeared on the screen, the first contact. He'd attempted since his sentencing 6 months earlier. "Mom, I know what tomorrow is," he said, his voice stripped of all the arrogance that had characterized our previous conversations. "I wanted to call before the anniversary." "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want to apologize. Not for legal reasons or because I'm hoping for something, but because I finally understand what I did to you. What I tried to do to Dad's memory." The words sounded genuine, but I'd learned not to trust Marcus's ability to manipulate emotions when he needed something. Understanding is different from feeling sorry you got caught. "I know you don't believe me, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that seeing what you've built, what you've accomplished, it's shown me who you really are, who you always were. I was too selfish and too stupid to see it before. Marcus, I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change anything. The damage you did isn't just to our relationship. It's to the trust that should exist between family members, to the security elderly people should feel with their children. I know. And I know that the work you're doing now, the people you're helping, it's probably more important than anything I'll ever accomplish. I just wanted you to know that I see that now." After I hung up, I realized that Marcus's call had given me something I hadn't expected: closure. Not reconciliation, but the knowledge that he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd attempted to destroy and what his failure had helped create. The next morning, the anniversary of Thomas's death, dawned clear and bright. I visited his grave, carrying flowers from the garden he'd loved, and news of the legacy his protective planning had created. Standing beside his headstone, I told him about the families we'd helped, the legislation we'd inspired, and the future we were building in his memory. "You saved me, Thomas," I whispered to the morning air. "But more than that, you saved hundreds of families who don't even know your name. Your planning didn't just protect me from Marcus, it protected everyone who came after." That afternoon, I hosted a celebration at our home for the volunteers, staff, and community members who had made the Thomas Whitmore initiative possible. The house that Marcus had tried to steal was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the work his attempted exploitation had inspired. Mrs. Patterson brought her grandson, who was studying law and wanted to specialize in elder protection. Catherine's daughter announced her engagement to a social worker who had joined our staff after seeing how our model could help vulnerable families. Dr. Martinez's teenage son presented a research project he'd completed on the economic impact of elder abuse prevention. Eleanor has shown us that individual tragedy can become community triumph when it's channeled through expertise, determination, and love, said Mayor Wallace during her remarks. The Whitmore legacy isn't just about protecting elderly people. It's about creating a world where vulnerability becomes strength and isolation becomes community. As evening fell and our guests departed, I sat alone in the study where this extraordinary journey had begun. The file cabinet that once held 40 years of local legal work now contained correspondence with advocates across the nation, research, data that was changing policy discussions, and plans for initiatives that would protect families for generations to come. The woman Marcus had tried to force into assisted living had become someone neither of us could have imagined. A nationally recognized advocate whose influence extended across multiple states, whose legal strategies were being taught in law schools, and whose story was inspiring other elderly people to fight back against exploitation. But more importantly, I had become someone Thomas would be proud of. Someone who had taken his protective planning and transformed it into something larger, something that honored his memory while creating a legacy that would outlast both our lives. The phone rang one final time that day, a call from Lisa Hamilton at the Attorney General's office. "Eleanor, I wanted you to know that we've received approval for the federal grant to expand the Whitmore model to all 50 states. Your husband's planning didn't just protect you. It's going to protect elderly people across the entire country." That night, I drafted a letter to be included in the legal files for future generations of the families we'd served. "The greatest lesson I've learned is that love doesn't end with death," I wrote. Thomas's love for me became protection for countless families he never met. My love for him became advocacy for people whose names I'll never know. When we choose to transform pain into purpose, individual love becomes community protection. Marcus had tried to steal my security, my dignity, and my independence. Instead, his betrayal had given me a mission that was more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished. In 4 decades of professional practice, the mother he'd tried to exploit had become the advocate he'd never expected, and the consequences of his choices were protecting families far beyond anything he'd tried to destroy. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This ended with something more powerful: transformation, legacy, and the absolute certainty that love, properly channeled, can overcome any betrayal and create protection that lasts for generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Their wives, Jessica and Amanda, were polished women in their 20s who treated me with the kind of careful politeness reserved for elderly relatives they barely knew. They spoke about me in third person, even when I was sitting right there, discussing my emotional state and future plans as if I were incapable of participating in decisions about my own life. They had arrived with garment bags full of appropriate funeral attire and a list of tasks that needed to be completed with military precision. I had spent the last 28 years sacrificing pieces of myself for this family. When Marcus wanted to attend that expensive private school, I had taken a second job cleaning offices after my shift at the insurance agency ended. When David needed help with law school tuition, Robert and I had refinanced the house, pushing our retirement plans back by years. When both boys wanted elaborate weddings, I had quietly sold my grandmother's jewelry collection, pieces that had been in our family for generations, to help cover the costs they couldn't quite manage on their own. Robert had always supported these decisions, though I sometimes caught him staring at our retirement statements with a worry he tried to hide from me. We had planned to travel after the boys were settled to finally take that trip to Ireland we had been dreaming about since our honeymoon. The brochures still sat in his nightstand drawer, dog-eared from years of wishful planning. Now those dreams lay buried with him, and I was left to wonder if all those sacrifices had been worth it. The wake was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock, but people had started arriving early, filling the funeral home with whispered conversations and the rustle of tissues. Robert had been well-liked in our small Connecticut town, a man who coached Little League for 15 years and never missed a church fundraiser. The American Legion was sending an honor guard, recognition for his military service that he had never talked about much, but had shaped the quiet dignity he carried throughout his life. I stood beside the casket in a black dress that Jessica had picked out for me, claiming my own dress was too dated for such an important day. The fabric felt foreign against my skin, expensive and structured in a way that made me feel like I was wearing a costume. My hair had been styled by Amanda, who had insisted that my usual simple ponytail wouldn't be appropriate for receiving mourners. I felt like a stranger in my own grief, molded into someone else's version of the proper widow. The first few hours passed in a receiving line of handshakes and embraces, neighbors and coworkers sharing memories of Robert that made me smile despite my tears. Mrs. Patterson from down the street brought a casserole and a story about Robert helping her move furniture last Christmas. Tom from the hardware store where Robert had worked for 18 years stood in front of me for 10 minutes, sharing tales of my husband's patience with difficult customers and his willingness to stay late to help anyone with a home repair emergency. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These were the moments I treasured, hearing about the man I had loved from people who had witnessed his kindness in spaces I never saw. Each story added another layer to my understanding of who Robert had been beyond our home, beyond his role as father and husband. He had been a man who quietly made the world a little better wherever he went, and that knowledge provided a comfort that all the sympathy cards in the world couldn't match. But as the afternoon wore on, I noticed my sons growing restless. They stood near the back of the room, their wives beside them, checking their watches and whispering among themselves. When people approached them to share memories of their father, they responded with polite but brief acknowledgments, as if they were fulfilling an obligation rather than participating in a celebration of Robert's life. Marcus kept glancing toward the parking lot, and I realized he was calculating drive times and flight schedules, already planning his escape back to his real life. David was fielding work calls in the hallway, speaking in low tones about cases that apparently couldn't wait until after his father was buried. Their wives had positioned themselves near the guest book, directing the flow of visitors with the efficiency of event planners rather than daughters-in-law saying goodbye to a man who had welcomed them into our family with open arms. The breaking point came when Father McKenna approached me to discuss the eulogy. He had known Robert for over a decade, had officiated both boys' weddings, and wanted to make sure he captured the essence of the man we were honoring. As he spoke about Robert's devotion to family, his work ethic, and his quiet faith, I felt tears streaming down my face. Not just tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude that someone understood the magnitude of the loss we were all supposed to be sharing. That's when I heard Marcus's voice cutting through the funeral home's hushed atmosphere. He was standing 20 feet away, but his words carried clearly in the carpeted silence. Could she be any more dramatic? His voice held the same dismissive tone he had used as a teenager when I embarrassed him in front of his friends. Look at her sobbing all over Father McKenna. She's making a scene. David nodded in agreement, his expression tight with what I could only interpret as annoyance. She's been like this since Dad died, completely falling apart. It's embarrassing. Honestly, we're trying to maintain some dignity here, and she's acting like she's the only one who lost someone. Jessica placed a manicured hand on Marcus's arm, her voice carrying that particular pitch women use when they're trying to sound compassionate while being anything but. Maybe we should say something. People are starting to stare. This isn't how your father would have wanted to be remembered. Amanda chimed in with the casual cruelty that only comes from someone who has never experienced real loss. I mean, I get that she's upset, but at some point, you have to pull yourself together. We all have lives to get back to. The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable stripping away another layer of the dignity I was trying so hard to maintain. These were my children, the babies I had nursed through countless midnight fevers, the toddlers I had chased through playgrounds, the teenagers I had supported through heartbreaks and disappointments. These were the young men I had cheered for at every graduation, every promotion, every milestone that had marked their journey into successful adulthood. And they saw my grief, my very human response to losing the love of my life, as an embarrassment, to be managed. Father McKenna had paused mid-sentence, clearly having heard the exchange. His kind eyes searched my face, and I saw in them a reflection of my own shock. He had buried hundreds of people over his 40-year career, had comforted countless widows and widowers, and I could see that even he was stunned by what he had witnessed. I excused myself quietly, walking past my sons without making eye contact, past the visitors who had come to honor Robert, past the flowers and sympathy cards and all the traditional trappings of grief. I made my way to the small family room behind the main parlor, a space the funeral director had told us was available if we needed privacy during the viewing. The room was simple, furnished with a small couch and a table holding a box of tissues and a pitcher of water. I sat down heavily, my legs suddenly unable to support the weight of what I had just learned about my own children. For 28 years, I had believed we were a close family. I had believed that love and sacrifice created unbreakable bonds, that the countless hours I had spent driving to soccer games and science fairs and college visits had built something meaningful and lasting. But sitting in that quiet room, listening to the muffled sounds of Robert's wake continuing without me, I realized I had been living in a fantasy of my own creation. My sons didn't see me as a grieving widow deserving of comfort and understanding. They saw me as an inconvenience, a source of potential embarrassment, a problem to be managed so they could return to their important lives with minimal disruption. The door opened softly, and Father McKenna entered, his weathered face etched with concern. He had been a constant presence in our lives for over a decade, baptizing grandchildren, blessing anniversaries, providing counsel during the small crises that mark any long marriage. He had known Robert as a man of faith and integrity, and he had known me as a devoted wife and mother who rarely missed Sunday Mass and never hesitated to volunteer for church functions. "Margaret," he said gently, using the formal name that only he and my mother had ever used. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. No one should have to bear that kind of judgment while mourning their husband." I looked up at him, this man who had provided comfort to so many families during their darkest hours, and I felt something shift inside me. Not the familiar urge to make excuses for my children's behavior, not the maternal instinct to protect them from criticism, but something harder and clearer. "They're right, though, aren't they?" I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I am being dramatic. I am falling apart. I am embarrassing them." Father McKenna sat down beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. "You're grieving, Margaret. You're saying goodbye to a man you loved for 3 decades. If that isn't worth falling apart over, then nothing is." I stared at my hands, at the wedding ring that felt too heavy on my finger, at the calluses from years of working 2 jobs to support my family's dreams. "I don't think they see it that way. I don't think they see me at all, actually. I think they see an obligation, a burden, something to be managed until they can get back to their real lives." The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I had never spoken this truth out loud before, not even to Robert during those late-night conversations when we wondered if we had done enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough to ensure our children's happiness. Father McKenna was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent counseling families through their most difficult moments. "What are you going to do, Margaret? How are you going to handle this knowledge?" It was a question I couldn't answer, not yet. But sitting in that small room, surrounded by the sounds of people honoring my husband's memory while my own children dismissed my pain, I felt something crystallizing inside me, a recognition that the woman who had spent 28 years putting everyone else's needs before her own had died alongside Robert. And whoever emerged from this funeral would be someone entirely different. Someone who finally understood that love without respect isn't love at all. I stood outside the funeral home for what felt like hours, watching through the windows as visitors continued to pay their respects to Robert. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. I had always loved this time of year, when the world transformed itself in preparation for dormancy. Now I wondered if I was experiencing my own kind of seasonal change, shedding the person I had been to become someone I didn't yet recognize. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop had arrived with a beautiful arrangement of white roses, Robert's favorite. She had known him since we were newlyweds, had provided flowers for every anniversary, every birthday, every celebration that marked our life together. She looked around the room, clearly searching for me, and I watched through the window as Marcus approached her with his practiced funeral smile, accepting her condolences with the same efficiency he brought to his business meetings. It struck me then how easily I had been erased from my own husband's farewell. My sons had seamlessly stepped into the role of primary mourners, accepting sympathy and managing details while I stood outside like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong service. They weren't malicious in their takeover, I realized. They simply didn't see me as capable of handling the responsibility of grief in an acceptable manner. This revelation was perhaps more devastating than overhearing their cruel assessment of my emotional state. They had reduced me to a liability, to be managed rather than a partner in saying goodbye to the man who had been the cornerstone of all our lives. I thought about all the times Robert had quietly stepped in to mediate when the boys were critical of my choices, how he had always insisted that their mother deserved respect even when they disagreed with my decisions. Robert had been my defender, my advocate, my steady presence who reminded our sons that their success had been built on a foundation of their mother's sacrifices. Without him, I was discovering just how little regard they truly held for the woman who had shaped their childhood and supported their dreams at the cost of her own. A black sedan pulled into the parking lot, and I recognized it immediately as belonging to my sister Patricia. She had driven down from Vermont as soon as I called with the news, leaving her own family responsibilities to be present during these difficult days. Patricia emerged from the car with the determined stride of a woman on a mission, her auburn hair styled in the same practical bob she had worn for 20 years, her face set with the expression that had intimidated neighborhood bullies when we were children. She spotted me immediately and marched across the parking lot with purpose. Patricia had always been the fighter in our family, the one who never backed down from confrontation and never accepted less than what she believed she deserved. At 55, she had built a successful accounting practice, raised 3 respectful children, and maintained a marriage that weathered its storms through mutual respect rather than constant sacrifice. "Margaret, what are you doing out here?" she demanded, her voice carrying that familiar note of protective anger that had been my shield throughout childhood. "You should be inside with your family, not standing in a parking lot looking like you've been banished." I tried to smile, to reassure her that everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself telling her about Marcus's comments, about David's dismissive attitude, about how they had transformed my grief into their embarrassment. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she stood silent for a moment, her hands clenched at her sides. Patricia had always been fond of my boys, had spoiled them as an aunt should, but she had also been the only person brave enough to suggest that Robert and I were perhaps too generous with our support, too willing to sacrifice our own needs for their convenience. "Those ungrateful little shits," she said finally, her voice low and dangerous. "After everything you've done for them, everything you've given up, they have the audacity to be embarrassed by your grief at your husband's funeral?" Her anger was validating in a way that surprised me. For so many years, I had been surrounded by people who praised my dedication to my family, who held me up as an example of maternal devotion. But Patricia's fury reminded me that devotion should flow both ways, that the children who had benefited from my sacrifices owed me something more than tolerance and management. "What do you want to do?" she asked, and something in her tone suggested She wasn't just offering emotional support. Patricia had always been a woman of action, someone who believed that problems were solved through decisive intervention rather than patient endurance. I looked back at the funeral home, at the people, gathered to honor Robert's memory, at my sons who were efficiently managing a grief they clearly wished would be more convenient. "I want to go back inside and finish saying goodbye to my husband," I said slowly. "But I want to do it on my own terms." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Then let's go do that." We walked back into the funeral home together, and I felt my sister's presence like armor around me. The room was still full of visitors, the conversation subdued but warm as people shared memories and offered comfort to one another. I noticed immediately that Marcus and David were now stationed on opposite sides of the room, creating a clear division of territory that allowed them to manage the flow of sympathy with maximum efficiency. Father McKenna caught my eye as we entered and offered an encouraging nod. I realized he had been watching for my return, ready to provide support if needed. There was something deeply comforting about having people in my corner, witnesses to my right to grieve in whatever manner felt authentic to me. I walked directly to Robert's casket, ignoring the subtle looks from my sons and their wives. Patricia positioned herself slightly behind me, a silent sentinel who radiated the kind of protective energy that had kept playground bullies at bay 4 decades earlier. I placed my hand on the polished wood and felt the tears come again. Not the dramatic sobbing that had embarrassed my children, but the quiet weeping of a woman saying a private goodbye to her best friend. Robert looked peaceful in death, wearing the navy suit he had bought for David's wedding 3 years earlier. He had complained about the expense at the time, muttering about young people's extravagant expectations, but he had worn it with pride as he walked our youngest son down the aisle. The same suit now served as his final formal wear, a detail that would have amused him if he could have known. I bent closer to the casket, speaking in whispers that only Robert could hear. I told him about the boys' behavior, about their assessment of my grief as inappropriate and embarrassing. I told him how sorry I was that they couldn't see past their own discomfort to honor his memory properly. I promised him that I would find a way to live with dignity, even if that meant disappointing the children who had already decided I was a source of shame. As I straightened up, I became aware of a presence beside me. Marcus had approached, his expression carefully neutral, his voice pitched low enough to avoid attracting attention from the other mourners. "Mom, we need to talk about tomorrow," he said, his tone suggesting this was a business meeting rather than a conversation between mother and son. "The funeral service, the burial, the reception afterward. We've made some arrangements that should help everything go smoothly." I looked at him, this young man who carried Robert's eyes but none of his warmth, and felt a strange detachment settling over me. "What arrangements?" "Well, Jessica and Amanda have coordinated with the church ladies about the luncheon. They've planned a menu that should accommodate everyone's dietary restrictions. David has written a eulogy that covers Dad's main accomplishments without going on too long. And we've arranged for you to sit in the front pew with Patricia, so you'll have support if you get overwhelmed." Each word was delivered with the calm efficiency of someone solving a logistical problem. There was no acknowledgement that these were decisions about my husband's final farewell, no recognition that I might have opinions about how we honored the man I had loved for 3 decades. They had simply assumed that their judgment was superior to mine and had proceeded accordingly. "I see," I said quietly. "And what about my eulogy?" Marcus looked confused. "Your eulogy?" "Yes, my speech about my husband. The man I lived with for 28 years, who shared my bed and my dreams and my fears. Did you think I might have something to say about him?" I watched my son's face process this unexpected complication. It clearly hadn't occurred to him that I might want to speak at Robert's funeral, that the widow might have something meaningful to contribute to her husband's memorial service. "Mom, I don't think that's a good idea," he said carefully. "You're very emotional right now, and speaking In front of a large group might be too much for you to handle. David's eulogy covers everything important. The casual dismissal of my emotional intelligence, my right to participate in my own husband's funeral, my ability to honor the man who had been the center of my world for 3 decades, crystallized something inside me. This wasn't protective concern. This was management of an inconvenient relative who couldn't be trusted to behave appropriately during an important social event. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I will be delivering a eulogy tomorrow. I have things to say about your father that David, despite his excellent writing skills, couldn't possibly know. I will be speaking about the man who held my hand through 2 miscarriages, who worked overtime for 10 years to pay off the house early, who cried when each of you was born, and again when you graduated from college. I will be speaking about my husband, not your father. There's a difference." My son's expression shifted through several emotions, settling finally on barely concealed annoyance. "Mom, please be reasonable. We're trying to make this as easy as possible for everyone." "Easy for whom?" I asked. "For the people who loved your father and want to hear about the man he really was? Or easy for the people who want to get through this with minimum emotional disruption so they can return to their regularly scheduled lives?" Marcus looked around the room, clearly hoping someone would intervene to support his position. His gaze landed on David, who had noticed our conversation and was making his way over with the determined stride of reinforcement arriving to support a defensive position. "What's going on?" David asked, his lawyer instincts immediately assessing the situation for potential conflict. "Mom wants to give a eulogy tomorrow," Marcus explained, his tone suggesting I had proposed something wildly inappropriate. David's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mom, that's really not necessary. I've already prepared something that covers all the important points. Father McKenna said the service should be kept to a reasonable length, and adding another speech would extend things unnecessarily." I looked at my younger son, this young man who had inherited his father's analytical mind, but none of his emotional intelligence. David had always been the child who questioned my decisions, who challenged my authority with legal precision even as a teenager. Now he was applying the same approach to my grief, treating my desire to honor my husband as an unnecessary complication to be efficiently resolved. "David," I said calmly, "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you of my intention. I will be speaking about your father tomorrow, and Father McKenna will make room in the service for my remarks." The brothers exchanged a look that communicated volumes about their assessment of my mental state and their strategy for managing this unexpected rebellion. It was the same look they had shared as children when they were coordinating a united front against parental authority, except now the roles were reversed and they saw themselves as the responsible adults managing an unreasonable parent. "Fine," Marcus said finally, his tone suggesting magnanimous tolerance of an elderly person's whims. "But please keep it brief, and try to stay composed. People will be watching." The implication that my grief was a performance for public consumption, rather than the authentic expression of profound loss, struck me with unexpected force. In that moment, I realized that my son saw my emotional state not as evidence of deep love, but as a character flaw to be minimized for social acceptability. Patricia had been standing close enough to hear the entire exchange, and I felt her move closer to my side, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in recognizing the cruelty disguised as concern. Her presence gave me the courage to say what needed to be said. "Marcus, David," I began, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used since they were children, "I want you both to understand something very clearly. Tomorrow we are burying your father, my husband, a man who deserves to be honored by the people who knew him best. I knew him best. I will speak about him with the love and grief and dignity he deserves. If that makes you uncomfortable, if that embarrasses you in front of your friends and colleagues, then I suggest you examine why your discomfort is more important to you than proper respect for your father's memory." The silence that followed my words seemed to expand beyond our small group, creating a pocket of tension that drew curious glances from nearby mourners. My sons stared at me with expressions I had never seen before, a mixture of shock and calculation that suggested they were rapidly reassessing their understanding of who their mother was and what she was capable of. Jessica and Amanda had materialized beside their husbands, drawn by some invisible signal that suggested crisis management was required. They flanked the brothers like a well-rehearsed support team, their expressions carefully neutral but their body language radiating disapproval. "Mrs. Patterson," Jessica began, her voice carrying that particular tone of gentle condescension reserved for managing difficult elderly relatives. "We all want what's best for tomorrow's service. Maybe we could discuss this privately later, when emotions aren't running so high." The suggestion that my emotions were the problem, that my grief was an obstacle to be managed rather than honored, completed my transformation. In that moment, standing beside my husband's casket with my family treating me like an inconvenient stranger, I understood that the woman who had spent 28 years prioritizing everyone else's comfort over her own needs was gone forever. What stood in her place was someone I was just beginning to meet. I slept surprisingly well that night, perhaps because for the first time in years I had spoken my truth without apologizing for it. The morning of Robert's funeral dawned gray and cold, the kind of November day that makes you grateful for warm coffee and wool coats. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the oak tree Robert had planted when Marcus was born. It's bare, branches reaching toward a sky that matched my mood perfectly. Patricia had stayed overnight, sleeping in the guest room that had once been David's childhood sanctuary. She appeared in my kitchen at 6:30, already dressed in a simple black dress that somehow managed to look both respectful and formidable. She was stirring eggs in a pan, the domestic gesture so familiar yet surprising that it took me a moment to remember she was here as my ally, not my caretaker. "You need to eat," she said without turning around. "Today is going to require strength, and you can't draw from an empty well." I accepted the plate of scrambled eggs and toast, realizing I hadn't eaten a proper meal since Robert's death 4 days ago. The food tasted better than it had any right to, and I felt some essential energy returning to my body as I ate. Patricia sat across from me with her own breakfast, and we ate in comfortable silence, punctuated only by the morning news playing softly on the kitchen television. At 8 o'clock, my phone began ringing. Marcus, checking on my emotional state and reminding me of the schedule they had created. Then David, ostensibly calling to see if I needed anything, but really ensuring I understood the importance of maintaining composure during the service. Then Jessica, offering to help me choose appropriate jewelry. Then Amanda, suggesting I might want to touch up my hair color before appearing in front of so many people. I answered each call with polite brevity, confirming that I would be ready on time and declining their various offers of assistance. Patricia watched these interactions with growing amusement, clearly recognizing the pattern of control disguised as concern. "They're treating you like you're 90 and senile," she observed after I hung up from Amanda's call. "When did you become their problem to solve instead of their mother to respect?" It was a question I had been asking myself since yesterday's revelation. When had the shift occurred? When had I transitioned from being the family's foundation to being its liability? I thought back through the years, trying to pinpoint the moment when my children stopped seeing me as a person with agency and began viewing me as a responsibility to be managed. Perhaps it had been gradual, so subtle that none of us noticed it happening. Each time I deferred to their judgment about family decisions, each time I prioritized their comfort over my own preferences, each time I accepted their criticism as evidence of my inadequacy rather than their ingratitude, I had reinforced their belief that their opinions mattered more than mine. Robert had tried to warn me in his gentle way. During our last serious conversation, just 2 weeks before his death, he had mentioned his concern about the boys' treatment of me. "They take you for granted, Maggie," he had said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "They assume you'll always be there to clean up their messes and fund their dreams." but they don't seem to see you as a person with needs of your own." I had dismissed his concerns at the time, defending our sons with the same protective instinct that had guided my parenting for 3 decades. Now I wondered if Robert had seen something I was only beginning to recognize, if his quiet support had been the only thing standing between me and the complete erosion of my identity within our family. At 9:30, I began getting ready for the funeral with deliberate intention. Instead of the conservative black dress Jessica had selected for me, I chose the navy blue dress Robert had bought me for our last anniversary. It was elegant without being flashy, sophisticated without being severe, and it made me feel like the woman my husband had fallen in love with rather than the convenient mother my children had learned to manage. I styled my hair the way Robert had always liked it, swept back in a soft chignon that showed off the pearl earrings he had given me for my 50th birthday. I applied makeup with more care than I had taken in months, not to impress anyone else but to honor the woman Robert had chosen to spend his life with. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I had almost forgotten existed, someone who deserved respect and consideration rather than management and tolerance. Patricia appeared in my bedroom doorway at 10:15, carrying a small wrapped package. "Robert asked me to give this to you after the funeral," she said gently, "but I think you should have it now." Inside the package was a silver bracelet engraved with a simple message: "For the strongest woman I know, who never knew her own strength, love always R." The gift was so perfectly Robert, so quietly supportive and encouraging, that I felt tears threaten to ruin my carefully applied makeup. "He brought it to me 3 weeks ago," Patricia explained. "He said he wanted to make sure you had something to remind you of your worth, especially if he wasn't there to remind you himself. He was worried about how the boys would treat you if something happened to him." The bracelet felt warm against my wrist, a tangible connection to the man who had seen my value even when I couldn't see it myself. Robert had known, somehow, that this day would come, that I would need a reminder of who I was beyond my roles as mother and caretaker. He had prepared for my emancipation, even as I remained unaware that I needed liberating. We arrived at the church 45 minutes before the service, early enough to have a few private moments with Robert before the official proceedings began. St. Margaret's was the church where we had been married, where both boys had been baptized, where we had celebrated countless Christmas masses and Easter vigils. Father McKenna had arranged for the casket to be placed at the front of the sanctuary, surrounded by the flowers that had been arriving since yesterday. I walked down the center aisle slowly, taking in the familiar stained glass windows that told the story of Christ's resurrection, the wooden pews that had held 3 generations of our family, the altar where Robert and I had promised to love each other in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part. We had kept those promises, and now death had indeed parted us, but I felt his presence in this sacred space more strongly than I had since he died. Marcus and David arrived with their wives at exactly the time they had scheduled, their entrance, carefully timed to demonstrate appropriate respect without excessive emotional display. They approached Robert's casket with the same efficiency they brought to every family obligation, paying their respects with measured solemnity that somehow felt more like a performance than genuine grief. I watched them from my seat in the front pew. These men I had raised to be successful and responsible, and felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with Robert's death. They were good men in many ways, productive members of society who paid their taxes and treated their employees well, and contributed to charitable causes. But they had learned to measure value in terms of productivity and convenience. And by those standards, a grieving widow was indeed an inconvenience to be managed. The church began filling with mourners at 10:45, a steady stream of people who had known Robert in various capacities throughout his 54 years. His co-workers from the hardware store arrived together, wearing their best suits and carrying stories I had never heard about my husband's kindness and humor. The members of his bowling league filled an entire pew, their presence a reminder that Robert had maintained friendships and interests beyond our family circle. Mrs. Rodriguez from the elementary school where Robert had volunteered as a reading tutor brought her 3 young children, all of whom had learned to love books under his patient guidance. The American Legion Honor Guard took their positions with military precision, their presence a tribute to Robert's service that he would have found both touching and embarrassing. By 11 o'clock, the church was nearly full, a congregation of people whose lives had been touched by Robert's quiet goodness. I felt overwhelmed by the evidence of my husband's impact on his community, humbled by the realization that his influence had extended far beyond our small family circle. These people had come not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection for a man who had made their lives a little better simply by being himself. Father McKenna began the service with a prayer that spoke of eternal rest and perpetual light, words I had heard at countless funerals, but which now carried personal weight that made my chest tight with grief. The familiar rituals of the Catholic funeral mass provided a structure for emotions too large and complex for ordinary expression, a framework that held my sorrow while honoring the sacredness of what we were losing. David delivered his eulogy, with the polished competence I had expected, touching on Robert's military service, his career dedication, his role as a father and community member. The speech was well written and appropriately emotional, covering all the basic facts of Robert's life with respectful efficiency. But listening to my younger son speak about his father, I realized that David was describing the public Robert, the man everyone knew, without touching on the private person who had been my companion through 3 decades of ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. When Father McKenna called my name, inviting me to the podium, I felt every eye in the church turned toward me. I walked to the front of the sanctuary with steady steps, carrying the pages I had written at 3 o'clock that morning when sleep finally abandoned me completely. I had written and rewritten my remarks a dozen times, trying to capture the essence of the man I had loved without overwhelming the congregation with my personal grief. I looked out at the sea of faces, recognizing neighbors and co-workers and family friends who had shared pieces of our life together. In the front pew, I could see Marcus and David watching me with barely concealed anxiety, clearly worried about what their unpredictable mother might say in front of so many witnesses to their family's dignity. Robert Patterson was my husband. For 28 years, I began, my voice clear and strong in the acoustically perfect space. But before he was a husband, before he was a father, before he was a community member or a veteran or any of the other roles that defined his public life, he was simply a good man who believed that ordinary kindness could change the world. I spoke about the Robert who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning for 28 years, who never forgot our anniversary even when I did, who cried during sentimental movies and pretended he was just tired. I talked about the man who spent his weekends building tree houses and teaching neighborhood children how to use tools safely, who couldn't pass a broken-down car without stopping to offer help, who donated blood every 8 weeks for 30 years, because someone had once told him it was needed. I shared stories that my sons had never heard, memories from the years before they were born, and the quiet moments after they had left home. I spoke about Robert's dreams of traveling to Ireland to see the homeland his grandparents had left behind, about his secret ambition to write a book about his military experiences, about his plan to teach woodworking classes to underprivileged kids after he retired. As I spoke, I watched the congregation's faces change, saw recognition dawning as they realized they were hearing about aspects of Robert they had never known existed. Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly when I mentioned his love for her garden roses. Tom from the hardware store smiled when I described Robert's patient explanation of plumbing repairs to customers who had no idea what they were doing. But it was the story I told near the end that seemed to resonate most deeply, the one that captured the essence of who Robert had been when no one else was watching. 3 months ago, I said, my voice steady despite the tears I could feel gathering, Robert and I were walking through downtown when we saw an elderly homeless man sitting outside the bank. Robert stopped, as he always did, to give the man some money. But this time he noticed the man's shoes were completely worn through, held together with duct tape and hope. I paused, looking directly at my sons as I continued. Robert didn't just give him money that day. He took the man to the shoe store, bought him a good pair of work boots, and then drove him to 3 different businesses until he found one willing to give him a chance at employment. The man started work the following Monday, and Robert checked on him every week until the day he died, making sure he had what he needed to succeed. The church was completely silent now, even the children sitting still as they absorbed the story of a man who saw dignity in everyone he met. That was Robert, I concluded. He didn't believe in grand gestures or public recognition. He believed in seeing people, really seeing them, and responding to what they needed with whatever he had to give. He saw me, truly saw me, for 28 years, and he taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. It's choosing every day to honor the person you're with, to respect their dreams even when they're different from yours, to support their growth even when it's inconvenient. I looked directly at Marcus and David as I spoke my final words. Robert's greatest hope was that the love and respect he showed to others would be reflected in how his family treated one another, especially in difficult times when it would be easier to be selfish or dismissive. I hope we can honor his memory by living up to that expectation. I returned to my seat in silence, feeling the weight of what I had just revealed. I had not only honored Robert's memory, I had delivered a subtle but unmistakable message to my sons about the standards of respect and dignity their father had exemplified and expected. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers, communion, and final blessings. But I was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere in the church, the way people looked at me differently after hearing me speak about the man I had loved. I had transformed myself from the grieving widow who needed management into the woman who had known Robert most intimately and could speak about his character with authority and grace. As we prepared to leave for the cemetery, Mrs. Rodriguez approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson," she said softly, "thank you for sharing those stories. I worked with Robert for 5 years, but I learned more about him in the last 10 minutes than I had in all that time. You honored him beautifully." Her words were echoed by dozens of other mourners who stopped to shake my hand or embrace me as we made our way out of the church. They weren't offering the careful sympathy reserved for someone who couldn't handle reality. They were expressing genuine gratitude for the gift I had given them, the opportunity to know Robert more deeply through the eyes of the woman who had loved him best. I noticed that Marcus and David hung back, watching these interactions with expressions I couldn't quite read. Their wives flanked them like protective barriers, clearly uncomfortable with the attention their mother-in-law was receiving. For the first time in our relationship, I was the center of positive attention, while they stood on the periphery, and the role reversal seemed to unsettle them profoundly. At the cemetery, as we gathered around Robert's gravesite for the final prayers, I felt a strange sense of completion. Not because my grief was ending, but because I had finally honored both Robert and myself with the dignity we deserved. I had spoken my truth without apology, had claimed my right to define our relationship without seeking permission from people who had never understood its depth. As Father McKenna spoke the final words of committal, as the honor guard folded the American flag with ceremonial precision, as the first handfuls of earth fell onto Robert's casket, I felt something settling into place inside me. The woman who had spent 28 years seeking approval and avoiding conflict was being buried alongside her husband. What emerged from that graveside was someone I was only beginning to understand, but someone I was eager to meet. The reception, following Robert's burial, was held in the church fellowship hall, a familiar space where we had celebrated countless parish events over the years. The ladies' auxiliary had prepared a spread of casseroles and sandwiches, their offering of comfort. Through food, a tradition as old as grief itself, I moved through the room accepting condolences and sharing memories, feeling more connected to these community members than I had to my own family throughout the entire week. Mrs. Patterson from the elementary school pulled me aside near the dessert table, her weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength. "Margaret, I've been wanting to talk to you about something important," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years managing classroom dynamics. "The school board has been discussing the need for a grief counselor, someone to help children process loss in a healthy way. After hearing you speak today, after seeing how you've handled your own tragedy with such grace, I think you'd be perfect for the position." The suggestion caught me completely off guard. I had worked in insurance for 23 years, a steady but uninspiring job that paid the bills and provided health benefits for our family. The idea that I might have skills valuable to children, that my experience with loss could be transformed into something helpful for others, had never occurred to me. "I don't have any training in counseling," I protested, but Mrs. Patterson waved away my objection. "You have something more valuable than training," she said firmly. "You have wisdom earned through real experience. You understand loss and recovery in a way that textbooks can't teach. The children need someone who's walked through grief and come out stronger, not someone who's only read about it in graduate school." Her words planted a seed that I wasn't ready to examine fully, but which settled into my consciousness with surprising weight. For the first time in decades, someone was suggesting that my life experiences had value beyond their utility to my family, that the pain I had endured might have purpose beyond personal growth. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed my sons maintaining careful distance from me, speaking to other mourners with practiced efficiency while avoiding extended conversation with their mother. It was as if my eulogy had created an uncomfortable truth they weren't ready to address, a mirror reflecting aspects of their behavior they preferred not to examine. Jessica approached me near the end of the reception, her smile carefully calibrated to suggest concern rather than criticism. "Margaret, Marcus, and I have been talking about your living situation," she began, her tone carrying that particular blend of helpfulness and condescension I was learning to recognize. "This house is so big for just one person, and maintaining it will be such a burden. We think you should consider selling and moving into one of those nice senior communities where you'd have built-in social activities and maintenance included." The assumption that I was incapable of managing my own home, that I needed to be relocated to a more manageable environment where my needs could be efficiently met, was so breathtakingly presumptuous that I found myself momentarily speechless. Jessica continued her sales pitch, describing amenities like scheduled mealtimes and organized craft activities as if she were discussing arrangements for a particularly challenging elderly relative. "That's very thoughtful of you to be concerned about my welfare," I said finally, my voice carrying a sweetness that masked steel. "But I'm perfectly capable of maintaining my own home, and I have no intention of moving anywhere. This house holds 28 years of memories with Robert, and I'm not ready to abandon them for the convenience of simplified living." Jessica's smile flickered slightly, clearly thrown by my unexpected resistance to her well-intentioned management of my future. "Of course you're capable," she said quickly, "but wouldn't it be nice to have less responsibility? To be able to focus on healing without worrying about yard work and home repairs?" The implication that grief had rendered me incompetent to handle basic adult responsibilities was the final straw in a week full of condescending concern. I looked at this young woman who had known me for less than 5 years, who had never shown interest in my thoughts or opinions except when they conflicted with her plans, and felt a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. "Jessica," I said calmly, "I appreciate your concern, but I think there's been a misunderstanding about my current state of mind. I'm grieving my husband's death, not experiencing cognitive decline. I'm perfectly capable of making decisions about my own life, and I don't require assistance from people who barely know me to determine what's best for my future." The conversation died an uncomfortable death, leaving Jessica staring at me with an expression of shocked confusion. She had clearly expected grateful acceptance of her guidance, not polite but firm rejection of her authority to make decisions about my life. Patricia, who had been watching this exchange from across the room, materialized at my side with the timing of someone who had been monitoring the situation for intervention opportunities. "Everything okay here?" she asked pleasantly, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic in my favor. "Just discussing Margaret's housing options," Jessica replied, her voice slightly strained. "We want to make sure she has all the support she needs during this difficult time." Patricia's expression shifted to one of polite interest that I recognized as dangerous territory for anyone on the receiving end. "How thoughtful of you to be so invested in Margaret's living arrangements," she said warmly. "I'm sure she appreciates knowing that her family is ready to help her make such important decisions about her own life." The subtle sarcasm in Patricia's tone was apparently lost on Jessica, who nodded earnestly and excused herself to rejoin her husband. I watched her hurry across the room to Marcus, clearly reporting the unexpected resistance she had encountered to what should have been a straightforward discussion about practical arrangements. "She's something else," Patricia observed quietly. "The audacity of a woman who's known you for 5 minutes trying to reorganize your entire life because she's decided you're incompetent to manage your own affairs." I found myself laughing for the first time since Robert's death, not from humor, but from the absurd recognition of how thoroughly my family had reconstructed me in their imagination. Somewhere in the years since my sons had reached adulthood, I had been transformed from their capable mother into their inconvenient responsibility, someone whose decisions required oversight and whose emotions required management. As the reception wound down and people began gathering their coats and purses, Father McKenna approached me with an envelope in his hand. "Margaret, this arrived at the church yesterday," he said gently. "It's addressed to you, but I thought it might be better to wait until after the service to give it to you." The envelope was cream-colored and expensive, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from Robert's commanding officer during his military service, a man named Colonel Harrison, who had tracked down news of Robert's death through military networks. "Dear Mrs. Patterson," the letter began, "I was deeply saddened to learn of Robert's passing. Though it has been nearly 30 years since we served together, I have never forgotten the kind of man your husband was, or the sacrifice you made in supporting his military career during those difficult early years of your marriage." The letter went on to describe Robert's character as a young soldier, his dedication to his fellow servicemen, and his frequent mentions of the wife who was working 2 jobs to support them while he completed his military service. Colonel Harrison described conversations where Robert had spoken with deep gratitude about my willingness to defer my own educational goals so he could focus on his military training, sacrifices I had long forgotten, but which had apparently made a lasting impression on the men who served with him. "Your husband often spoke of his determination to spend the rest of his life proving worthy of the woman who had believed in him when he was just a scared kid from Connecticut with no clear direction," the letter continued. "From everything I've heard about the life you built together, he succeeded in that goal. Please know that Robert's memory lives on not just in your family, but in the hearts of the men who learned about honor and commitment by watching how he spoke about you." The letter concluded with an invitation to visit the military cemetery where several of Robert's unit members were buried, and an offer to share more stories about my husband's service if I was ever interested in hearing them. Colonel Harrison included his phone number and a promise that Robert's military family would always consider me part of their extended community. Reading this letter in the church fellowship hall, surrounded by the remnants of my husband's funeral reception, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of my own story. For years, I had viewed my early sacrifices as simply what wives did, unremarkable choices that required no special recognition or gratitude. But here was evidence that Robert had seen those sacrifices clearly, had spoken about them with respect, and appreciation to the men who became his brothers in arms. More importantly, here was validation from someone who had known Robert in a completely different context, that the man I had loved and mourned was worthy of that love, that our partnership had been built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation rather than convenience and habit. As I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my purse, I became aware that Marcus and David were approaching, their wives trailing behind like a well-trained support team. They had clearly been waiting for the crowd to thin before addressing whatever issues my unexpected assertiveness had created in their carefully managed family dynamic. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus began, his tone carrying the forced patience of someone dealing with a difficult situation. "About some of the things that were said today, some of the decisions that need to be made going forward." I looked at my sons, these successful young men who had inherited their father's intelligence, but somehow missed the lessons about respect and humility that had made Robert so beloved in his community. They stood before me like a delegation sent to negotiate with a foreign power, formal and cautious and slightly condescending. "What decisions?" I asked simply. David stepped forward, clearly having been designated as the spokesperson for this intervention. "Well, there are practical matters to consider. Dad's life insurance, the mortgage, your financial security. We think it would be wise to set up a meeting with a financial planner to review your options and make sure you're protected." The implication that I was incapable of managing my own finances without male supervision was so outdated and insulting that I found myself wondering when my sons had developed such retrograde attitudes about women's capabilities. Had they always viewed me as fundamentally incompetent? Or was this a recent development triggered by my emotional response to their father's death? "I've been managing our family's finances for 28 years, I said calmly. "I think I can handle reviewing insurance policies and mortgage payments without supervision." Marcus and David exchanged that look again, the one that communicated their shared assessment that their mother was being unreasonably difficult about accepting help that was clearly in her best interest. "Of course you're capable," David said, quickly. "But there are probably aspects of financial planning that Dad handled, investments and retirement accounts that you might not be familiar with. We just want to make sure you have professional guidance to avoid making any mistakes that could impact your long-term security." The condescension was so thick I could practically taste it, but what struck me most was the complete absence of curiosity about what I might actually know or want. They had created a narrative in which I was a helpless widow who needed their protection and guidance, and they were proceeding with that assumption regardless of evidence to the contrary. "Boys," I said, using the term deliberately to remind them of the relationship dynamic they seemed to have forgotten. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I need you to understand something very clearly. I am not your responsibility to manage. I am your mother, a grown woman who has been making decisions and handling challenges for 52 years. Your father's death has not rendered me incompetent or childlike, and I won't be treated as if it has." The silence that followed my words was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the sound of church ladies clearing tables in the background. My sons stared at me with expressions of shock that suggested I had just announced my intention to join the circus rather than simply assert my right to adult autonomy. Jessica cleared her throat delicately, clearly feeling that female intervention might be more successful than the direct approach their husbands had attempted. "Margaret, no one is questioning your competence," she said gently. "We're just trying to help you transition to this new phase of your life with as little stress as possible." The assumption that widowhood was a phase to be transitioned through, rather than a permanent change in my life, circumstances was revealing in its casual dismissal of the depth of my loss. But even more telling was the continued insistence that their help was necessary for my successful navigation of basic adult responsibilities. "Jessica," I said with deliberate kindness, "I understand that you mean well, but I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what I need from my family right now. I don't need to be managed or transitioned or guided through decisions about my own life. What I need is respect for my judgment, support for my choices, and recognition that grief doesn't equal incompetence." Amanda, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up with the blunt honesty that her careful sister-in-law had been avoiding. "Margaret, we're just worried that you're not thinking clearly right now. The eulogy today, the way you've been acting all week, it's not like you. were concerned that you might make decisions while you're emotional that you'll regret later. There it was, the heart of their concern laid bare. My unexpected assertiveness, my refusal to accept their management of my grief and my future, my insistence on speaking at Robert's funeral despite their objections, all of this was evidence of emotional instability rather than personal growth. They had interpreted my emergence from decades of self-sacrifice as a mental health crisis requiring intervention. I looked around the fellowship hall, at the church ladies who were finishing their cleanup while studiously avoiding our family drama, at Father McKenna who was tactfully organizing papers at the far end of the room, at Patricia who was watching from a respectful distance but clearly ready to intervene if needed. "You're right," I said finally, turning back to my sons and their wives. "I'm not acting like myself. The woman you've known for the past several years, the one who apologized for having opinions and deferred to everyone else's judgment about her own life, that woman died alongside your father. What you're seeing now is who I actually am when I'm not trying to be convenient for everyone else." I picked up my purse and moved toward the door, feeling lighter with each step away from their concerned disapproval. I'm going home now to begin, figuring out what the rest of my life looks like. When you're ready to treat me as an adult with agency rather than a problem to be solved, you know where to find me. As I walked across the parking lot toward Patricia's car, I heard Marcus calling my name, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he was beginning to realize that their usual methods of family management might not be effective. With this new version of their mother, I didn't turn around. For the first time in my adult life, I kept walking away from my children's demands for my attention, my compliance, my willingness to be the person they needed me to be, rather than the person I actually was. The woman Robert had fallen in love with was finally ready to come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.